Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into a pair of boots that nobody, and I mean nobody, actually wanted to fill. You are a medieval executioner. Right now, in this moment, you are standing at the edge of a torchlit town square, the air smelling of wood smoke and unwashed wool and something else you have learned not to think about too hard, and every single person in this crowd knows your face and refuses to meet your eyes. Children are pointed away from you by their mothers. The priest on the far side of the square says his prayers a little louder when you walk past. You have a steady job, a municipal salary, and one of the most guaranteed employment contracts in the entire feudal world, and somehow, impossibly, that has made your life worse. You probably won't survive this with your dignity entirely intact, and honestly, that is the most medieval thing about the whole arrangement. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is. I love seeing the night owls and the accidental insomniacs from every corner of the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is somewhere in the long, unhurried middle of the medieval period, let's say the 14th century, because the 14th century had a particular talent for making everyone miserable in creative and overlapping ways. You did not choose this profession the way a baker chooses bread or a blacksmith chooses iron. The choice, in most cases, was made for you by a combination of desperate circumstance, inherited obligation, or the kind of civic arm-twisting that medieval authorities had quietly perfected over generations. Towns needed executioners the way they needed sewage ditches, absolutely essentially, and with precisely the same level of enthusiasm for the people doing the actual work. Let's back up and place you properly inside this world, because the role of the executioner was not a simple or a single thing. The Latin term most commonly applied was carnifex, which translates with wonderful bluntness as fleshmaker or butcher, and the various regional languages of medieval Europe developed their own vocabulary for the position, words that almost universally carried a faint or not-so-faint whiff of moral contamination. In German-speaking territories, the word Scharfrichter, literally sharp judge, developed alongside the older and considerably more loaded term Henker, which carried connotations of hanging and lingered in the language as a mild oath for centuries after public execution had faded from the town square. In French, bourreau. In English, hangman eventually became dominant, though the role encompassed considerably more than hanging alone. Whatever they called you, the title came preloaded with social meaning, and that meaning was almost never flattering. Here is the mainstream historical fact you need to anchor yourself to. In medieval and early modern Europe, the executioner was a licensed municipal official. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. You were, in the most literal bureaucratic sense, a city employee. Towns and cities posted formal notices seeking candidates, negotiated salaries, provided housing, often on the outskirts of the settlement, for reasons we will get deeply into, and issued you a formal letter of appointment that functioned as both your job description and your legal protection. Without that letter, killing someone in the manner you were about to kill them would simply be murder. With it, you were the arm of secular justice, carrying out sentences handed down by magistrates and lords who were themselves very careful never to be anywhere near the actual execution when it happened. Funny how that works. The appointment process itself carried a strange, heavy dignity. In many German cities, and the German municipal records on this topic are some of the richest surviving sources we have, the executioner was formally installed in a ceremony that had quasi-religious overtones. He was presented to the city council. He swore oaths. He was given his instruments, the sword, the rope, the wheel, the various tools of a trade that we will spend considerable time examining. In a handover that resembled, just enough to make everyone slightly uncomfortable, the investiture of a guild master. There was honor embedded in this moment. Genuine, official, civic honor. And then the ceremony ended, and he walked home alone, because nobody wanted to walk beside him. This tension, essential yet despised, official yet outcast, is the central paradox of your working life, and it did not resolve itself neatly at any point in the medieval period. Historians still argue whether the stigma attached to the executioner was primarily religious in origin, rooted in older taboos about blood and death, or whether it was a more practical social mechanism, a way of containing and managing a figure whose power over life and death made ordinary people deeply, primally uncomfortable. Both explanations have merit, and they probably reinforced each other in ways that made the resulting stigma more durable than either cause alone could have managed. What we can say with confidence is that the stigma was old. Pre-Christian Roman society had its own complicated feelings about the carnifex, who was associated with the most degraded forms of execution, the crucifixion of slaves, the public punishment of criminals, and was typically a slave himself, operating at the absolute bottom of the social hierarchy. When Christianity became the dominant organizing framework of European society, it layered new theological anxieties on top of older cultural ones. Shedding blood, even lawfully, left a kind of moral residue. The church had complicated, evolving, and frequently contradictory things to say about whether an executioner could receive sacraments, whether he was in a state of sin by virtue of his profession, and whether the fact that he was doing the Lord's work, removing evil from the community, ensuring justice was done, offset the pollution that came from doing it with his hands. The answer, most of the time, was a deeply unsatisfying "it depends," which is the medieval church's way of saying, we would rather not commit to a position on this one. What this meant for your daily life was a kind of conditional acceptance that was almost worse than outright rejection. You were tolerated. You were necessary. On execution days, which in a busy city might happen several times a month, you were the most important person in the square. Everyone watched you. Your competence was a matter of public record, literally performed in front of hundreds or thousands of witnesses. A clean, swift execution reflected well on the city itself, on the quality of its justice, on the professionalism of its institutions. A botched one was a civic embarrassment, a source of rumor and dark laughter for months afterward, and potentially a cause of genuine crowd unrest. The pressure on you was, to put it mildly, considerable. And yet, when you stepped off that platform and walked through the market the following morning, the fishmonger looked away. The woman selling cloth pretended to be counting her bolts. Children who were absolutely old enough to know better pointed and whispered. You had done exactly what the city had paid you to do, performed it with skill and professionalism, and the reward was the same cold shoulder you had earned simply by existing in the role. This is the peculiar emotional mathematics of being a medieval executioner. You could not win, you could only perform, and performing well kept you employed and fed and housed but did not, would not, could not make you liked. Let's talk about how you got here, because the path to this position was rarely a straightforward one and was almost never a first choice. The most common route into the executioner's role, across the medieval and early modern periods, was inheritance. The job was hereditary in many jurisdictions, not legally mandated as such in every case, but socially enforced with the same iron consistency as any legal requirement. If your father was the executioner of a particular city, you were almost certainly going to be the next executioner of that city, because the stigma attached to the role followed the family, not just the individual. Your children were tainted by association before they were old enough to understand what their father did. They could not easily marry into respectable families. They could not easily enter guilds. The options available to them narrowed in precisely the direction of continuing the family trade, which is how dynasties of executioners emerged. Families like the Sansons in France, who would hold the office of Paris executioner across multiple generations, or the Franz Schmidt family in Nuremberg, whose 15th and 16th century patriarch left behind one of the most remarkable professional diaries in the history of any occupation. The other path was desperation. A man who had committed a crime serious enough to warrant death but not quite serious enough to warrant immediate execution might be offered a deal. Agree to take on the role of executioner, perform the sentence on some other condemned person, and your own life would be spared. This was a genuine practice, documented in multiple jurisdictions, and it carries a certain grim medieval logic. You answered violence with the threat of worse violence, and then you converted the object of that violence into an instrument of future violence, and you called it justice. The man who accepted this bargain found himself in the executioner's role without training, without family tradition, without the complex inherited knowledge that the hereditary practitioners had accumulated over decades. He was expected to figure it out. We will talk considerably more about what figuring it out meant in practice, because it was not, to put it gently, a smooth learning curve. There was also the occasional route through the military, Soldiers and mercenaries who had been involved in executions in a battlefield or camp context sometimes found that their familiarity with the technical requirements of the job made them candidates for municipal positions when they eventually settled in a city. And there were rarely men who sought the position out, who saw it as the reliable municipal employment it technically was, who needed income and housing and were willing to absorb the social cost. These individuals were viewed with particular suspicion by their neighbors, not because what they were doing was different from what the hereditary executioner was doing, but because choosing it voluntarily implied a character defect that inheritance alone did not. At least the hereditary man could not help what family he was born into. What was your excuse? You, sitting in this metaphorical pair of executioner's boots, need to understand that your appointment came with paperwork, with oaths, with a formal set of responsibilities that extended well beyond the execution platform itself. You were, in many cities, also responsible for managing the town's pillory and stocks, for supervising public floggings, for overseeing the branding of criminals, for carrying out torture during judicial proceedings, which in medieval and early modern law was not the extrajudicial horror it sounds like to modern ears, but a formally regulated part of the investigative process with specific rules about what could be done, to whom, and for how long. You were the city's specialist in coercion. You were the person called when the law needed a body to do something that no respectable body was willing to do. And you were paid. This is worth emphasizing, because the salary of a medieval executioner was not the poverty wage you might expect for a job this socially toxic. In many cities, the base pay was supplemented by per-execution fees, by the traditional rights to certain goods, the clothing of the executed, for instance, which could be resold, the body itself, which had a secondary market we will examine at length, and by fees for the various subsidiary services you provided. A skilled, experienced executioner in a large city could accumulate real wealth. He might own property. He might have servants. The money was there. What the money could not buy in this world was the thing everyone else in the town had for free, the simple, unremarkable social dignity of being a person other people were willing to stand next to at church. That church problem deserves its own moment, because it was not a minor inconvenience. In many towns and jurisdictions, the executioner and his family were required to sit in a designated area of the church, separated from the congregation in a way that was visible, formal, and unmistakable. Some churches had specific pews or sections for the Scharfrichter family. Some executioners were effectively denied communion, or received it under conditions that marked them as different, compromised, polluted in ways that the ritual of the Eucharist could acknowledge but not fully cleanse. The idea that a man might do righteous work in the service of justice and still be spiritually contaminated by the doing of it is one of those medieval paradoxes that resists easy resolution, and the Church, to its credit or discredit depending on your perspective, resisted resolving it for several centuries. You are settling into this role now, feeling the weight of the appointment, the cold specificity of what the job actually requires, the particular silence that falls in a room when you enter it. The blade is real. The salary is real. The loneliness, somehow, is the most real thing of all. Let's linger a little longer in the early days of your appointment, because the first weeks are a special kind of disorienting that the job description, such as it was, did not prepare you for. Imagine arriving in a new city to take up the post. Maybe you have been hired from another town, another region, because the previous executioner died or retired or, in some cases, was himself executed for something that the municipal authorities decided crossed even the executioner's professional line. You arrive with your tools in a cart, your family, if you have one, walking alongside you, and the reception you receive from the townspeople is a masterclass in the medieval art of the cold shoulder. They need you. They sent for you. They negotiated your salary through formal civic channels and drafted a contract that several respectable burghers put their seals to. And yet, when the cart rolls through the gate, the welcome is roughly equivalent to what a medieval town might offer a very large and very unwelcome rat. Your housing has been arranged. It is almost always on the periphery of the settlement, near the city wall, near the slaughterhouse, near the tannery, in the neighborhood of all the other necessary and unpleasant things that a city requires but prefers not to think about. In some cities, you live literally outside the walls, which is a precise architectural metaphor for your social position that even the most unimaginative medieval town planner could not have designed more efficiently. The house is functional. It is yours, often rent-free as part of your employment package, and it may be considerably larger than what a craftsman of comparable income could afford, because the lot it sits on is a lot that no respectable family wanted. Your neighbors, insofar as you have them, are the other people at the margins of medieval social life, those whose professions made them similarly untouchable. The knacker who dealt with dead animals. The night soil collector who dealt with what we will delicately call the city's other kind of waste. The grave digger. In some formulations, the Jewish community where one existed was assigned to the same marginal geography, which tells you something both about how medieval society organized its anxieties about contamination and about the company the executioner was understood to keep. You were at the edge, geographically, spiritually, socially, and the edge was where you would remain. There is a quirky and rather wonderful tidbit buried in the records of several medieval German cities that is worth pausing on here, because it captures this marginalization in a detail so specific it almost reads as comedy. In some jurisdictions, the executioner was required to use a separate well. Not because his water was actually contaminated. Not because there was any practical reason to believe that his presence at the communal well would compromise the water supply. But because the communal well was a social space. A place where people gathered, exchanged news, negotiated the small daily transactions of community life, and the executioner's presence at that space made people uncomfortable in ways they could not fully articulate and therefore chose to manage through the simple mechanism of exclusion. A man who dealt in death should have his own water. It seemed reasonable. Nobody examined it too closely. And this really is the texture of your daily life in this role. Not dramatic persecution, not formal legal disability in most cases, but an unending accumulation of small exclusions, small silences, small redirected gazes, that added up to something considerably heavier than any single incident could account for. You did not need to be chased out of the tavern with a broom. People simply found somewhere else to stand when you came in. The brewer still sold you your ale. He just did it quickly, took your coin without letting his fingers touch yours, and moved on. You noticed. You always noticed. After a few years, you stopped noticing because the alternative, continuing to notice, continuing to measure the distance between yourself and ordinary human warmth, was not something a person could sustain and still function. The function, after all, was the thing. You had a job to do, and it was a job that required considerably more skill, more knowledge, more careful professional preparation than anyone standing in that market watching you buy your ale would ever acknowledge or understand. The next time someone dismisses your career, modern readers, this is your gentle reminder that career is a complicated word. You might want to point out that medieval execution, performed correctly, was a genuine technical discipline, and performing it incorrectly had consequences not just for the condemned, but for you personally, professionally, and occasionally physically. Because an unhappy crowd was not a crowd that simply booed and went home. An unhappy crowd was something else entirely, and we will get to that when the time comes. For now, you are newly appointed. You are housed on the periphery. You have your tools and your contract and your carefully negotiated salary, and you have the cold, clear understanding that this city needs you with the same grudging necessity with which it needs its sewers and its slaughterhouses, and that this need will never, not once, translate into anything resembling warmth. You are the sharp edge of civic justice, and sharp edges, as every craftsman knows, are useful and handled carefully and kept at a distance when not in use. Welcome to the job. The tools in your cart are not going to teach themselves, and the city is not going to give you a grace period to figure things out. Somewhere in a cell beneath the magistrate's hall, there is almost certainly a man or a woman who has already been sentenced, already been told their date, already begun the particular psychological process of waiting for a death they know is coming. Your learning curve and their remaining days on Earth are operating on the same calendar, and that calendar does not have a pause button. So let's talk about how you actually learn to do this. The formal apprenticeship system for executioners was, by the standards of medieval guild training, both entirely logical and absolutely horrifying. In cities where the role was hereditary, which, as we established, was most of them, you began learning from your father or your uncle or whatever male relative held the position before you, at an age that would make any modern child welfare advocate reach immediately for their phone. Boys in executioner families were introduced to the subsidiary aspects of the trade, the management of prisoners, the preparation of equipment, the logistics of the platform, from early childhood, not out of cruelty but out of the same practical reasoning that put blacksmith's sons at the bellows and baker's sons at the flour sack. The work was the family's livelihood, and understanding it thoroughly was simply a condition of being born into that family. This meant that your earliest memories, if you grew up in this world, included things that other children's earliest memories did not. You remembered helping your father oil the joints of the breaking wheel. You remembered the smell of the execution ground, a smell that was specific and persistent and that you had long since stopped consciously registering, the way people who live near the sea stop hearing the waves. You remembered watching, from a careful distance, as your father worked, studying the mechanics of what he did with the detached professional attention of a tradesman's apprentice, because that is exactly what you were. The emotional dimension of this education was something that the system did not formally address, because medieval professional training did not generally concern itself with the emotional dimensions of anything. You learned, you watched, you assisted, you prepared. The assistance stage was itself a graduated curriculum of increasing proximity to the work. You began with the equipment, cleaning blades, checking rope for fraying, maintaining the various implements of your father's trade in the condition that professional pride and practical necessity both demanded. A dull blade was not merely an aesthetic failing. A dull blade was a humanitarian catastrophe in miniature, the difference between a clean stroke and a prolonged, ragged, public ordeal that would haunt the crowd's dreams and destroy your family's professional reputation in the space of a single afternoon. You learned this early, and you learned it with the specific focused attention of someone for whom the consequences of inattention were not a bad grade but a different kind of reckoning entirely. Then you assisted with the living condemned, escorting prisoners, securing bindings, managing the logistics of moving a person from the cell to the platform in a way that was both secure and, within the brutal constraints of the situation, as calm as it could be made. This last part surprises people, but it was genuinely part of the professional culture in many regions. A condemned person who arrived at the platform in a state of complete psychological collapse was harder to manage practically, more likely to create a scene that unsettled the crowd, and, in many of the religious frameworks that govern medieval thinking about death and judgment, less able to make the final confession and spiritual preparation that the church required. The executioner who could speak to the condemned, who could maintain a kind of grim professional steadiness that provided something to hold on to in the final minutes, was performing a service that was simultaneously practical and, in its strange way, pastoral. You were the last steady presence a person encountered before the end, and how you conducted yourself in that role was noted, discussed, and remembered. Historians still argue whether the relationship between the medieval executioner and the condemned was primarily functional, a professional managing a subject, or whether it carried genuine emotional complexity, a kind of enforced intimacy that left marks on both parties that the historical record, focused as it is on the mechanics of justice rather than its human texture, cannot fully capture. The diary of Franz Schmidt, the Nuremberg executioner who recorded his work in meticulous detail throughout the late 16th and early 17th centuries, offers glimpses of something more complicated than pure professional detachment. Entries that note the character of the condemned, their manner, their last words, in ways that suggest a man who was paying attention to more than the technical requirements of his job. But Schmidt was exceptional in his literacy and his record-keeping, and we cannot assume his inner life was typical of the trade. Your first execution. Let's get to it, because you have been circling it in your mind since the appointment was formalized, and there is no useful way to keep circling indefinitely. The scenario varies by region, by century, by the specific circumstances of your appointment, but let's construct a plausible version. You are assisting your father, or you are newly hired and being guided by an older colleague from a neighboring town, or, in the worst version of this story, you are on your own, having taken the position through the desperation route we discussed, and the city is simply expecting you to manage. The condemned has been brought up. The crowd is assembled. The magistrate or his representative is present to formally witness the execution of the sentence. Everything has its place in the choreography, and your place is at the center of it. If the sentence is hanging, the most common method across much of medieval Europe for ordinary criminal offenses, because rope was cheap and required no particular metallurgical expertise, your technical challenges are specific and, in their way, genuinely demanding. The calculation of drop length relative to the condemned person's weight and the condition of the rope was not a science that had been formally written down in any manual you could consult. It was knowledge transmitted through practice and observation, accumulated over generations of professional experience, and in the early days of your career you did not have that accumulated experience. You had what you had been told, what you had watched, and the rope in your hands. Too short a drop, and the condemned strangled slowly, which was not the quick judicial death the sentence prescribed and which the crowd found distressing in ways that ranged from genuine human sympathy to the more uncomfortable category of spectacle that has gone on too long. Too long a drop, and this particular miscalculation had its own category of horror, and the physics involved could be catastrophic in ways that required no further elaboration to anyone with a basic understanding of what happens when a rope goes suddenly taut under significant weight. The Goldilocks zone of judicial hanging was real, it was narrow, and finding it on your first attempt in front of hundreds of witnesses without the benefit of a trial run was the kind of professional pressure that does not appear in any modern career guide. Here is the quirky historical tidbit that tends to stop people mid-sip of whatever they are drinking. In some medieval jurisdictions, a hanging that was botched in specific ways, particularly if the rope broke, was taken as a sign of divine intervention. The condemned had survived the sentence, and God apparently had opinions about the matter. In England, this concept had enough cultural traction that a condemned person who survived a hanging might, in some circumstances and periods, petition for mercy on the grounds that heaven had weighed in. Whether the petition succeeded depended enormously on who the local lord was and what kind of day he was having, but the principle was real, was taken seriously, and put the executioner in the extraordinary position of being the instrument of a divine opinion he had not asked to express. If your rope broke, you had not merely failed professionally. You had potentially become an agent of God's editorial process. The theological implications were, to say the least, awkward. If the sentence was beheading, reserved in most of Europe for the nobility, reflecting the class consciousness that medieval society maintained even in its approach to killing people, the technical demands were different and in some ways more acute. Beheading with a sword was considered the more honorable death, appropriate to the status of the condemned, and a clean single stroke was not merely preferable but effectively mandatory. The sword needed to be maintained at a specific degree of sharpness, which you were responsible for. Your own physical condition mattered, the strength of your arms, the steadiness of your hands, the control of your swing. The positioning of the condemned was critical. The angle of approach had to be precise. And all of this had to be accomplished while wearing whatever ceremonial costume your jurisdiction required, while managing the crowd, while maintaining the formal dignity of a civic proceeding, while also being, inside the privacy of your own skull, a human being who was about to do something that human beings are not naturally inclined toward. The training for this was as hands-on as you would imagine and more systematic than you might expect. Practice was conducted on what was available, hay bales, to develop the swing, animal carcasses from the slaughterhouse, to develop the feel of resistance and the understanding of what a clean stroke required, occasionally, in the grimmer corners of the historical record, on the bodies of the already executed, who had no further need of their necks and whose remains were legally the property of the executioner in most jurisdictions anyway. You practiced until the motion was automatic, until the muscle memory was reliable enough to carry you through the moment when your conscious mind would be doing other things. Managing nerves, managing the crowd, managing the complicated internal weather of performing an execution in public for the first time. The mainstream historical fact underpinning all of this is straightforward. Beheading by sword was phased out in most of Europe over the course of the early modern period in favor of the guillotine precisely because the human variability of the sword stroke, the differences between executioners, the effects of fatigue and nerves and physical condition, made consistency impossible in a way that an engineered mechanical device was not. The guillotine, when it arrived, was not merely a product of Enlightenment humanism's concern for humane execution. It was also an engineering solution to a quality control problem that had plagued the profession for centuries. Your job in the pre-guillotine era was to be the quality control mechanism, and you were a fallible one, and everyone in the square on execution day knew it. The relationship between a young executioner and his mentor, father, uncle, or hired guide, was consequently one of the most loaded professional apprenticeships in medieval society. The older man was passing on not just technical knowledge but a complete way of navigating an impossible social position. a set of professional ethics that had evolved to make the work sustainable, and a kind of hard-won psychological scaffolding that allowed a person to perform executions repeatedly without losing their functional grip on ordinary life. How you held your face when you entered the square. How you spoke to the condemned in the final minutes. How you accepted payment afterward. A transaction that had its own complex etiquette in different regions, with some jurisdictions requiring that the fee be placed on the ground rather than handed directly to the executioner, so that the act of payment did not require the paying magistrate to touch the executioner's hand. How you went home afterward. What you told yourself. That last part, what you told yourself, was where the real curriculum lived, and it was the part that no formal training could fully address. The theological frameworks available helped up to a point. You were doing God's work. You were the instrument of lawful justice. The condemned had brought this upon themselves by their actions, and you were the mechanism by which the community's judgment was made physical and real. These framings were available to you, were culturally reinforced, were delivered by priests who, however ambivalently they felt about your immortal soul, understood that you needed something to hold on to. But frameworks, however sturdy, are not the same as peace, and the historical evidence suggests that many executioners found peace somewhere in the middle distance between professional habit and careful not thinking about it. What you ate for dinner on the night of your first execution, whether you slept, whether you dreamed, these things are not recorded in the municipal archives of the cities that kept such careful note of your salary and your appointment terms and your housing arrangement. The paperwork of medieval justice was thorough about what it valued, and what it valued was the deed, not the doer's interior life. You were the sharp edge. Edges do not have feelings. Edges are maintained and used and put away until the next time they are needed. Except, of course, that you did have feelings. And the next section is where we start to reckon with what those feelings, and the society that generated them, actually cost. The morning after your first execution, you wake up in your house at the edge of the city, or outside the walls, depending on your particular jurisdiction's preferences for where to put you, and the world has not changed. The sun is doing what the sun does. The market is opening. Somewhere in the distance, a cart horse is having strong opinions about something. Life, with its magnificent indifference to your psychological state, has resumed entirely without your input, and you need to get up and go out into it, because you are out of bread and the bread does not come to you. This is where the social reality of your profession stops being an abstract concept and becomes something you navigate with your body, in real time, in the specific geography of a specific town that knows exactly who you are and what you did yesterday and has already decided what that means about you. The stigma attached to the medieval executioner is one of the most thoroughly documented social phenomena in the historical record, which is saying something in a period that did not generally concern itself with the inner lives of people below a certain social stratum. The documentation exists not because medieval society was interested in the executioner's experience of being stigmatized, but because the stigma generated legal disputes, civic complaints, ecclesiastical debates, and the kind of bureaucratic paper trail that survives centuries rather better than human memory does. People complained about executioners. They complained formally in writing to authorities repeatedly over generations, and those complaints tell us, reading between the lines of the formal language of grievance, a very great deal about the texture of daily life at the margin of medieval respectability. Let's start with the most basic unit of social life, where you could live. We touched on this in the previous section, but the geography of exclusion deserves its full treatment, because it was not simply a matter of being assigned an inconvenient neighborhood. In many German cities, and again, the German municipal records are extraordinarily detailed on this point, the executioner's house was specifically designated in city ordinances, its location fixed by law rather than by market preference or personal choice. You did not choose to live near the city wall. The city chose it for you, codified the choice in writing, and defended it against any attempt at renegotiation. The executioner who attempted to purchase property in a more central neighborhood could find the sale challenged, blocked, or reversed by civic authorities responding to complaints from the neighbors who had no desire to find themselves living next to the Scharfrichter. This was not mere snobbery, though it was certainly that too. The objection ran deeper into a category of thinking that modern people find genuinely difficult to fully inhabit, the idea of pollution as a real, transmissible, quasi-physical property of certain people and certain acts. Medieval and early modern European society inherited from both classical antiquity and from older folk traditions a set of beliefs about contamination that operated alongside and sometimes in tension with Christian theology. Certain acts, certain professions, certain associations left a residue, not moral failing in the straightforward sense, not sin exactly, but a kind of adhesive spiritual grime that could transfer through proximity. The executioner had this grime in abundance. Living next to him meant living in the penumbra of it. Nobody wanted to live in the penumbra of it. The mainstream historical fact here is worth sitting with. In many European jurisdictions, the executioner's professional stigma was formally heritable, meaning it passed to his children regardless of whether they themselves practiced the trade. A daughter of an executioner who married into a guild family could, in some documented cases, cause her husband to be expelled from his guild, because her blood connection to the contaminated profession was considered sufficient to compromise his standing. This was not a universal rule, and it varied enormously by region, period, and the specific guild's own traditions, but it was real, it was documented, and it meant that the executioner's family carried his professional identity as a burden that could not be set down simply by choosing a different career. Historians still argue whether this hereditary stigma was primarily a product of guild culture, which was intensely concerned with the purity of lineage and the exclusion of those deemed dishonorable, or whether it reflected deeper folk beliefs about the transmissibility of spiritual contamination through bloodlines. The guild explanation has the advantage of institutional clarity. Guilds had formal mechanisms for investigating members' backgrounds, formal criteria for exclusion, and formal records that preserved the outcomes of their deliberations. The folk belief explanation has the advantage of explaining why the stigma persisted in communities that had no formal guild structure to enforce it, why the farmer in a village without any guilds whatsoever still did not want his daughter marrying the executioner's son. Both explanations are probably true in different contexts, and neither entirely excludes the other. For your son, specifically, this hereditary contamination was a practical catastrophe. The guild system was the primary mechanism of economic mobility in medieval urban society. To enter a trade, to become a baker, a weaver, a cobbler, a metalworker of any description, you needed guild membership, and guild membership required an investigation into your background that the guild's masters conducted with the thoroughness of people who had strong opinions about who was allowed in their professional community. Your son, presenting himself for apprenticeship in any respectable trade, would face questions about his father's profession. The answers to those questions would, in most cases, close the door. Not always, not everywhere. The records contain exceptions, moments of civic grace or practical necessity where the rule bent. But the rule was the rule, and it bent reluctantly. What this meant in practice was that the executioner's sons tended to become executioners, not because they chose it, but because the alternatives contracted around them with the quiet, inexorable pressure of social forces that never needed to announce themselves to be effective. The girl who would not walk home from church with your daughter. The master who looked at your son's application and found reasons to defer a decision that somehow never resolved itself in approval. The way the other children's parents called them inside when the executioner's children came into the street to play. None of this required coordination. It required only the shared, unspoken consensus of a community that knew what it thought and acted accordingly. Your daughter's marriage prospects were a particular source of sustained anxiety, because marriage in medieval society was not merely a personal arrangement but an economic and social contract that bound families together, and no respectable family wanted to be bound to yours. The pool of eligible men for an executioner's daughter was, in most communities, severely restricted. She could marry within the trade another executioner's son, from the same city or from a neighboring one, in the kind of professional endogamy that the stigma effectively enforced. She could marry into the other marginal professions. The knacker's son, the night soil collector's son, the men from the edge of the settlement who shared her father's social geography if not his specific profession. Or she could remain unmarried, which in medieval society carried its own significant practical and social costs. The marriage question was so practically significant that it generated its own body of legal and ecclesiastical debate. Could an executioner's daughter contract a valid marriage with a man from a respectable family if the man's family was not informed of her background? If such a marriage was discovered after the fact, what were the grounds for annulment? These questions were real, were brought before real authorities, and generated real decisions that the records preserve. The answers varied, but the very existence of the debate tells you everything about the stakes involved. Your daughter's background was a secret that some people considered it a fraud to conceal and others considered it a mercy to overlook, and the line between those positions was drawn differently in every community and in every generation. Let's go to the tavern, because the tavern is where the social stigma becomes most immediately, physically real, and because the tavern was one of the primary social institutions of medieval life, the place where information was exchanged, alliances were formed, deals were made, and the social fabric of the community was woven and rewoven every evening over ale. And you could go to the tavern. Nobody was legally prevented from serving you. But what happened when you walked in was a social performance of exclusion so reliable that it might as well have been choreographed. The room went a little quieter. Not silent, silence would have been too dramatic, would have required the patrons to acknowledge your presence in a way that their avoidance was specifically designed to prevent. Just a degree quieter. Conversations that had been flowing freely found convenient pauses. People became interested in their cups. The group standing nearest the door discovered reasons to redistribute itself away from the entrance. You ordered your drink and the tapkeeper served you. Serving you was fine. Taking your coin was fine. Your coin was as good as anyone's. But he did not linger, did not lean on the bar for a chat, did not introduce you to the newcomer at the end who was looking for work and might have been good to know. You drank. You left. The room redistributed itself back to its previous configuration. This was the choreography, and it played out with such consistency across different cities, different decades, different centuries, that it has the quality of a social law rather than a series of individual choices. There is a wonderfully specific quirky tidbit that survives from several German city records concerning the executioner's participation in civic drinking rituals, the formal, ceremonial drinking that accompanied festivals, civic celebrations, and the various occasions on which the city gathered to drink together in an officially sanctioned capacity. In some cities, the executioner was permitted to attend these occasions but was required to drink from a specific vessel. His own cup, brought from home, or a designated cup that was kept separately and washed separately, and was understood by everyone present to be the executioner's cup and therefore not to be touched by anyone else. The logic was the same as the separate well. Not practical contamination but symbolic contamination, the management of an anxiety through the mechanism of physical separation. You could drink with the city. You just could not share its cup. The church attendance situation deserves its own extended moment, because the church was not merely a spiritual institution in medieval life. It was the primary organizational framework of community identity, the place where the community formally constituted itself as a community on a weekly basis. An exclusion from full participation in church life was therefore exclusion from something considerably more fundamental than Sunday morning. The executioner could generally attend church. He was a baptized Christian, and his profession, however contested its spiritual status, did not typically result in formal excommunication. But the quality of his church attendance was marked literally by spatial designation. The designated seating, in some German churches, a specific pew near the back or to the side, physically separated from the main congregation, was a statement that required no words and no announcement. Everyone knew which pew was the executioner's pew. Everyone knew not to sit in it, and everyone knew that sitting elsewhere was an act of social self-preservation rather than any particular animosity toward the individual who would occupy it. The children in the executioner's pew grew up understanding, through the wordless education of spatial arrangement, exactly where the community placed them. They grew up knowing it the way they knew their own names, not as information recently acquired but as a fundamental condition of existence. The priest, for his part, was in a complicated position. He needed the executioner, needed him in the sense that a community needed its necessary functions performed, but he also navigated a set of ecclesiastical traditions that were ambivalent about the man in ways that the priest's own training had not fully resolved. In many regions, the executioner was denied certain sacraments, or received them under conditions that marked him as different. In some periods and jurisdictions, the executioner could not serve as a godparent, a significant social exclusion in a world where godparentage was a primary mechanism of building social bonds and obligations across family lines. Your child, being baptized, would have godparents from the narrow world of people willing to take on that role for an executioner's family, which was a world roughly congruent with the world of people willing to marry into it. And yet, and this is the paradox that runs through everything, on execution day the priest was there, working alongside you, offering the condemned their last rites, their final confession, their spiritual preparation for what was about to happen. You and the priest stood in the same space, performed complementary functions, served the same judicial moment from your different professional positions. He prepared the soul. You released it. And then the ceremony ended, and he went back to his side of the social arrangement, and you went back to yours, and the brief professional alliance that execution day had created dissolved back into the ordinary distances of ordinary life. This is one of the details about the executioner's existence that is easiest to intellectualize and hardest to actually feel, the way that your professional necessity coexisted so completely with your social superfluity. You were needed right up until the moment the job was done, and then you were in the way. The crowd that watched you work with the focused attention of people who had come specifically to watch you work would, within the hour, have distributed itself back into the market and the taverns and the churches, and would deal with your presence there with precisely the same choreographed not-quite acknowledgement as any other Tuesday. The execution had happened. Justice had been done. The mechanism that had done it could now please return to its storage position at the edge of the city. The psychological weight of this was real, and it was cumulative, and it landed differently on different people. Some executioners appear in the historical record as men who had made a successful accommodation with their position, who had found sufficient satisfaction in the professional aspects of their work, sufficient community within the narrow social world available to them, sufficient meaning in the theological framings of their role, to live what seems, from the outside, like a functional and even occasionally contented life. Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg, whose diary is our richest window into the professional psychology of the trade, seems to have been such a man, methodical, professionally proud, religiously sincere in ways that gave his work a meaning his own community was reluctant to grant it. Others accommodated less successfully. The records contain executioners who drank too much, a professional hazard in a world where drink was one of the primary available mechanisms for managing difficult inner weather. Executioners who became involved in the kinds of petty criminality that their position theoretically made them immune to but their character apparently did not. Executioners who simply walked away from the position, forfeiting their salary and housing and the limited social scaffolding their role provided, in favor of an anonymity that a different city and a different name might make possible. The escapees from the executioner's identity were more numerous than the official records suggest, because the official records tracked the position, not the person, and a man who left was simply replaced by the next appointment. Your children, in the end, are the most honest measure of what this life cost. They did not choose it. They were born into it, into the designated pew and the separate cup and the narrowed marriage pool and the guild doors that stayed closed regardless of how persistently they knocked. They carried your professional identity into their own lives as an inheritance that no amount of distance or reinvention could fully shed, because medieval communities had long memories and the executioner's family was exactly the kind of thing those communities remembered. The question of what you owed them, whether staying in the role was a betrayal of their futures or leaving it was a betrayal of your obligations, was one that every executioner with children eventually faced, in some form, in the quiet of the house at the edge of the city where the normal rules of the community had always applied to everyone except you. Before any of the social arithmetic of your position can be fully understood, you need to look at what is actually sitting on your workbench. Because the tools of the medieval executioner's trade were not simply instruments of death. They were a professional kit of considerable complexity, each item with its own maintenance requirements, its own technical specifications, its own symbolic weight in the choreography of public justice, and its own fascinating and occasionally absurd bureaucratic history. You are, in the most literal sense, only as good as your equipment, and your equipment is your responsibility, your investment, and in many jurisdictions your personal property. Let's start with the sword, because the sword is where professional pride lived most visibly in this trade. The executioner's sword, the Richtschwert in German, a word that translates with characteristic directness as judgment sword, was not a combat weapon. This distinction matters enormously and is one that modern people, accustomed to thinking of swords in the context of warfare and Hollywood choreography, tend to underappreciate. The executioner's sword was a specialist instrument, purpose-built for a single specific task, optimized for that task with the same careful engineering that a surgeon's scalpel or a craftsman's finest chisel represented in their respective trades. It was typically broader than a combat sword, heavier toward the tip to carry momentum through the stroke, and blunt-pointed because you were never going to thrust with this weapon, and a point would be at best irrelevant and at worst a liability in a tool whose only job was to deliver a controlled horizontal arc with maximum efficiency. The blade needed to be maintained at a specific degree of sharpness that was itself a form of professional knowledge. Not the razor edge of a blade designed for slicing, but a particular quality of keenness that would part cleanly through what it needed to part through without binding, without requiring a second stroke, without any of the outcomes that everyone on the platform was desperately trying to avoid. You sharpened it yourself or under your direct supervision, using whetstones and techniques that were part of your professional knowledge base. The sword was inspected before every use. Its edge was tested. Its balance was checked. You did not hand this instrument to an apprentice and hope for the best. You handled it personally, with the focused attention that a professional musician gives to a fine instrument the night before a performance. Many surviving executioner's swords from the medieval and early modern periods are held in museum collections across Europe, and they are remarkable objects, often decorated with inscriptions, symbols, and imagery that transformed them from mere tools into ceremonial objects carrying explicit meaning. Latin phrases invoking justice, divine authority, or the legitimacy of secular power were common. Some bore images of the wheel, the gallows, or the scales, the iconography of justice made physical in the instrument of its application. These were not decorations added for aesthetic pleasure. They were statements of legitimacy, reminders to the executioner, to the condemned, to the watching crowd, that what was happening here was not murder but something the community had authorized, something the law had decreed, something God, in the theological framework of the time, had at minimum permitted and at maximum actively endorsed. The rope deserves equal attention, because hanging was far more common than beheading across most of medieval Europe, and the rope was therefore the working tool of most executioners most of the time. Rope quality varied, and rope quality mattered, and the management of rope was one of those aspects of the trade that sounds straightforwardly practical until you discover the extraordinary cultural freight that medieval and early modern society had loaded onto the humble length of hemp. Used execution rope was widely believed to carry magical and medicinal properties. We will get deeply into this in the section on secondary income streams, which meant that your used rope was not merely waste material to be discarded. It was a commodity with a market, and managing it appropriately was part of the job. The wheel was another primary instrument in your toolkit, and it represents perhaps the most viscerally medieval of the execution methods in your repertoire. Breaking on the wheel, Rädern in German, was reserved for the most serious offenses and was designed to be both lethal and prolonged in ways that expressed, through the duration and visibility of suffering, the severity of the crime being punished. The condemned was spread-eagled on a large cartwheel or flat platform, and the executioner used a heavy iron-rimmed wheel or a hammer to systematically break the bones of the limbs, working inward, before the final blow to the chest or neck ended the proceeding. This is where the PG-13 rating of tonight's story encounters some of its stiffest competition from historical reality, and we will leave the specific mechanics at the level of, it was exactly as unpleasant as it sounds, and move on to the professional angle. What the wheel required from you was not strength but precision and sequence. The particular bones, in the particular order, with the particular force, administered according to the sentence as specified by the court. Because the court did, in fact, specify. Medieval judicial sentences could be remarkably detailed in their instructions. How many blows, in what order, from which end of the body, with what pauses, and crucially, whether mercy was to be shown by ending the proceedings early if the condemned lost consciousness or died before the specified sequence was complete. You were executing a script, in both the theatrical and the manuscript sense of that word, and deviation from it, whether through incompetence or through unauthorized mercy, was a professional and potentially legal matter. The mainstream historical fact here is one that tends to produce a certain cognitive dissonance. The elaborate specification of execution methods in medieval court sentences was, in its way, a form of legal protection for the condemned. The specification constrained the executioner. It defined exactly what could be done and no more, establishing, within the brutal parameters of the penalty itself, a kind of due process that prevented extrajudicial cruelty. This was not a guarantee of humane treatment, obviously. It was a guarantee of predictable, legally authorized treatment, which is a much narrower and less comforting thing, but which represented, within its own framework, a genuine attempt to make punishment legible and controllable rather than arbitrary. The law that sentenced you to be broken on the wheel was a terrible law, but it was a law, and the executioner who violated its specific terms was himself subject to consequence. Your toolkit extended beyond the headline instruments. There were the irons, shackles, chains, the various devices for securing a prisoner during transport and during the preliminary stages of an execution proceeding. There were the branding irons, because branding was a common lesser sentence for a wide range of offenses, marking the body of the convicted in a way that would be visible to future employers, future communities, future magistrates who might need to assess a person's history at a glance. You maintained these, and you used them, and the skill required was real. A brand administered incorrectly could kill through infection when death was not the intended sentence, and an executioner whose lesser punishments produced unintended fatalities had a problem that was simultaneously medical, legal, and reputational. There were also the instruments associated with torture, the judicial torture that formed a recognized part of the investigative process in medieval law. The strappado, which involved suspension from bound arms, the rack, which is exactly what you think it is, various devices for the application of controlled pressure to extremities, the tools for managing the whole unpleasant business of extracting confessions from people who had not volunteered them. Here, too, the law was specific. Torture in the medieval judicial framework was not supposed to be unlimited. It had formal rules about how long it could last, how severe it could be, what evidence of prior fragility might exempt a person from it, and crucially, that a confession extracted under torture needed to be confirmed freely, without duress, on the following day before it could be used as the basis for a sentence. You were the instrument of a system that had, built into its most coercive mechanisms, a set of procedural constraints that its practitioners sometimes honored and sometimes didn't, and navigating that gap between the formal rule and the informal reality was part of the daily texture of your professional life. Now, the uniform, because you had one, and it is one of the more immediately striking visual elements of the executioner's professional identity, and it warrants its own moment of attention. The executioner's costume varied by region and period, but certain elements appeared with enough consistency to constitute something approaching a professional dress code. Red was the dominant color in many traditions. Red hood, red cloak, red garments, and the reasons for this are debated in ways that touch on both the practical and the symbolic. Red was the color of blood, obviously, which gave the costume an immediately legible symbolic resonance that required no interpretation from the audience. Red was also, in some traditions, the color of the executioner's official civic role, a statement of municipal authority rather than personal identity, the uniform of an office rather than the expression of an individual. The hood or mask deserves particular attention because it is the element of the executioner's costume that has most thoroughly colonized the cultural imagination and least accurately represents the historical reality. The hooded, masked executioner is a powerful image, anonymous, depersonalized, the face of justice rather than the face of a man, and it appears frequently enough in historical accounts and artistic representations to be real in some contexts. But it was not universal, and in many jurisdictions the executioner was known, recognizable, and entirely unmasked. The hood served different purposes in different contexts. Anonymity in situations where reprisals were feared, ceremony in situations where the ritual required it, practical protection in situations where the physical circumstances of the execution made it useful. It was not, as popular imagination tends to assume, the standard operating uniform of the trade everywhere and at all times. The preparation for an execution day was itself a ritualized process that began hours or sometimes days before the event. The equipment was inspected and prepared. The sword was sharpened. The rope was cut and knotted and tested. The platform, the scaffold, erected in the town square or on a dedicated execution ground, was inspected for structural integrity, because a scaffold that collapsed on execution day was a catastrophe on multiple levels simultaneously, and you were not going to let that happen on your watch. The route from the prison to the scaffold was walked, the logistics of the procession confirmed. And then there was the paperwork, because medieval justice, for all its brutality, was administered through a bureaucratic apparatus that generated documentation with an enthusiasm that any modern office worker would recognize. The formal warrant authorizing the execution, signed by the appropriate magistrate, sealed with the appropriate seal, had to be in your possession before you could proceed. The sentence had to be read aloud at the scaffold, because public justice required public declaration, and the declaration had to precede the act. The witnesses had to be identified and present. In many jurisdictions, a formal record of the execution was created afterward. The date, the method, the name of the condemned, the offense, and sometimes a brief notation on how the proceeding had gone, which is how we know as much as we do about the mechanics of individual historical executions. Here is the quirky tidbit that fits perfectly into this bureaucratic picture. In some German cities, the executioner was required to submit an itemized expense account after each execution, detailing the costs of the rope, any replacement equipment, the fees for assistance, travel expenses if the execution was conducted outside the city, and various other line items that transformed the killing of a human being into something that looked, on paper, remarkably like the expense report of a moderately busy municipal contractor. The city treasurer reviewed these accounts. Reimbursements were made. Disputes about specific line items were occasionally elevated to the city council for resolution. The bureaucracy of death was, in its way, magnificently mundane, a reminder that even the most extreme functions of the medieval state were administered through the same mechanisms of record-keeping and accountability that governed the purchase of new cobblestones for the market square. The checklist you ran through before an execution was not written down. Not for you, because most executioners in the medieval period were not literate, and the knowledge lived in practice rather than documentation. But it was real, it was systematic, and it was the difference between a proceeding that served its intended social function and one that became a civic embarrassment. The sword, the rope, the warrant, the witnesses, the scaffold, the condemned, escorted from the cell with the combination of security and steadiness that the role required. The priest, positioned for his complementary function. The crowd, managed not by you but by whatever civic guards the city had deployed, though the crowd's behavior was something you understood and monitored from the platform with the peripheral attention of a professional who had learned that crowds had their own moods and that those moods mattered. Everything in its place. Everything checked and rechecked. The bureaucratic machinery of public justice, assembled and ready, waiting for you to step into your position at its center and do the thing that all of this preparation existed to accomplish. The warrant was legal. The sentence was just. The sword was sharp. You were ready, or you told yourself you were, and the difference between those two things was something you had learned, early and efficiently, not to examine too closely. The morning of an execution day arrives with a specific quality of light that you have learned to recognize before you are fully awake. There is something in the way sound travels through the city on these mornings, a particular density of movement, a slightly elevated pitch of general activity. The sound of the scaffold's wooden boards settling in the early cold that carries through the streets in ways that ordinary mornings do not produce. The city knows. The city has known for days because executions were not surprises. They were announced, posted, discussed, anticipated with the complex mixture of dread and appetite that public spectacle reliably produced in communities that had precious few alternatives for large-scale collective entertainment. You are already awake. You have probably been awake for some time. The condemned has been in the cell since sentencing, which may have been days ago or weeks ago depending on the jurisdiction and the backlog of the court's business. And in that time they have had the particular experience of knowing with complete certainty what is going to happen to them and on what date, which is a psychological situation that philosophers and theologians of the period discussed with considerable intensity and that you, from your position, have observed in enough individuals to have developed a working taxonomy of how people respond to it. Some become very still. Some become very loud. Some find religion with an urgency that their previous lives had not suggested they possessed. Some eat everything put in front of them with the focused attention of people determined to enjoy what remains. Some refuse to eat at all. The condemned you are escorting today is one of these types, and you have assessed which one within the first few minutes of entering the cell. Because reading the person you are about to work with is part of your professional skill set in ways that no one who has not done this job will ever entirely understand. The procession from the cell to the scaffold is the first public act of the day, and it is loaded with ceremony in ways that vary by region and century but share a common logic. The procession is the community's formal announcement that justice is in motion, that the machinery of the law is operating, that the sentence which was handed down in the relative privacy of the magistrate's hall is now being made real in the public space where everyone can see it and bear witness. The condemned walks or is carried, if they cannot walk, or is pulled, if they will not walk, because the procession must happen regardless of the condemned's cooperation with it. You walk alongside or immediately behind, in your official capacity, in your official costume, performing the role of the state's representative in a piece of civic theater that everyone present understands to be theater without that understanding in any way diminishing its power or its purpose. The crowd lines the route. This is the first crowd management challenge of the day, and it is one that the civic guards nominally handle but that you monitor with your own professional attention, because crowds at processions had their own behavioral repertoire and not all of it was benign. Sympathy for the condemned could manifest as interference, attempts to slip them food, drink, or messages. In more extreme cases, attempts at physical intervention that the guards needed to suppress. Hostility toward the condemned, more common in cases where the crime had directly affected members of the community, could manifest as projectile throwing, which was tolerated within informal limits and suppressed beyond them. The line between acceptable crowd participation and dangerous disorder was a negotiated one, and everyone present understood its general location even if it was never formally written down. Here is the mainstream historical fact that tends to reframe how people think about public execution as an institution. For most of the medieval and early modern periods, public execution was explicitly understood to be a pedagogical event. It was education, in the broadest possible sense, a demonstration, performed for the community's benefit, of the consequences of certain actions and the power of the authority that administered those consequences. The crowd was not incidental to the execution. The crowd was the point. An execution performed without witnesses, without the community gathered to see, to understand, to carry the memory of what they had seen back into their daily lives, would have missed its entire social purpose, which was not merely to remove a dangerous individual from the community but to inscribe, in the most viscerally memorable way possible, the terms of the community's understanding of acceptable behavior. You were not just killing someone, you were teaching a lesson. The scaffold was a classroom, and the lesson was written in the kind of ink that people did not forget. The scaffold itself, when you mount it, is a stage in every sense of the word. It is elevated so that the maximum number of people can see what happens on it. It is constructed to be sturdy, you check this, remember, and its elevation gives you a view of the crowd that reverses the usual dynamics of your social existence in a way that is, briefly, something. Down there, in that crowd, are people who will not meet your eyes in the market. People who find reasons to be elsewhere when you enter a room. People who manage your presence in their community through the careful choreography of avoidance. Up here, on the platform, every one of them is looking at you. Every one of them is attending to what you do with the focused, unblinking attention that they would never grant you in any other context. It is not admiration. It is not respect, exactly. But it is attention, and after a life spent in the particular cold of being looked through rather than looked at, attention has its own complicated warmth. The reading of the sentence comes first. A clerk or herald, positioned at the edge of the scaffold or in a designated spot nearby, reads aloud the formal document that authorizes what is about to happen. The name of the condemned, the offense, the sentence as determined by the court, the legal authority under which the sentence is being carried out. This reading is not a formality in the dismissive sense of something that everyone is simply waiting to get through. It is a formal legal act that transforms what follows from violence into justice, from killing into execution, and its public declaration is the mechanism by which the community is made a witness to the legitimacy of the proceeding. Everyone present hears the warrant. Everyone present is, in a legal and moral sense, a witness to its execution. The community does this together. Then the priest. The condemned's final confession, if they make one, is private, conducted in whatever space of semi-privacy the scaffold's public position permits, with you maintaining a respectful distance that is simultaneously genuine consideration for the condemned's final moments and a practical professional assessment of their physical state and likely behavior. The last rites follow, the formal sacramental structure that the church required to send a soul into whatever came next with the appropriate spiritual preparation. This moment is one of the few in which your role is explicitly subordinate. You wait, you watch, you give the process its necessary time. Because rushing this portion of the proceeding was one of the things that crowds noticed and resented in ways that could turn a manageable day into an unmanageable one. And then it is your moment. The priest steps back. The condemned is positioned, and how they are positioned depends on the method, but in every case their positioning is something you have done before, have practiced, understand in the specific physical way that comes from repetition rather than instruction. A person who has never done this before does not know, in the body, how to efficiently position another person for what is about to happen. You do. This knowledge is in your hands, in your posture, in the small adjustments you make that are invisible to the crowd but that constitute the real technical content of your professional expertise. If it is a hanging, the rope goes around the neck with a specific knot. The placement of the knot matters, the tightness of the noose matters, and these are adjusted with a speed and efficiency that is, in its way, a form of mercy, because the less time the condemned spends waiting in the noose before the drop, the better for everyone. The drop, the moment when the platform opens or the ladder is turned or whatever mechanism your particular scaffold employs is activated, is the moment. There is no rehearsal for this specific moment with this specific person. There is only the preparation you have done, the calculation you have made, and the motion that follows. If the sword is today's instrument, you have positioned the condemned kneeling or bending forward over a block, have confirmed their stillness, have checked your own position one final time, feet placement, grip, angle, and have drawn the sword to its ready position. The crowd goes very quiet in this moment. You have noticed this every time, and it never quite stops being remarkable. The silence that falls over hundreds of people in the seconds before the stroke. A collective held breath that constitutes, in its way, a form of respect that you will never receive in any other context from any of the people currently holding it. Then the stroke, and then the silence ends, and the crowd's noise reassembles itself from the held breath into something considerably more complicated. Here is where everything can go wrong, and going wrong in public, in front of the entire community, is the specific nightmare that lives at the center of every executioner's professional anxiety. The botched execution was not merely an embarrassment. It was a social catastrophe with consequences that radiated outward in every direction simultaneously. A botched hanging left a living, suffering, gasping, condemned person in front of a crowd that had not come to watch suffering, or rather, had come to watch the sanctioned, contained, properly concluded suffering of a judicial execution, not the open-ended, unresolved suffering of someone who was dying badly and slowly and with no clear endpoint. A crowd watching a botched hanging became uncomfortable very quickly, and uncomfortable crowds at public executions had a documented tendency to become angry crowds, and the target of that anger was frequently the person on the platform who had made the thing go wrong. The quirky historical tidbit here is that in some documented cases, a crowd that witnessed a particularly botched execution took matters into its own hands in ways that were simultaneously horrifying and, within their own logic, coherent, rushing the scaffold to end the condemned's suffering themselves, or rushing it to express their displeasure with the executioner in terms that required no verbal articulation whatsoever. The executioner who had botched a prominent execution sometimes needed to be physically protected by the civic guards from a crowd that had come to watch justice be done and felt, with some justification, that it had not been. You had guards for exactly this contingency. You hoped every time that you would not need them. A botched beheading was a different category of professional disaster, with its own specific horrors that we will decline to detail beyond noting that requiring a second stroke was, in many times and places, formally prohibited. The sentence specified a single blow, and deviation from the sentence was a legal matter, not merely an aesthetic one. Executioners who required multiple strokes were fined in some jurisdictions. In more extreme cases, in more extreme periods, they faced physical punishment of their own. The professional pressure to get it right the first time was therefore not merely a matter of pride or civic reputation but of personal legal exposure, which concentrated the mind wonderfully. Historians still argue whether the theatrical and ceremonial elements of public execution, the procession, the reading of the warrant, the priest's involvement, the formal choreography of the scaffold, served primarily to reinforce the authority of the state. As some scholarly traditions have emphasized, or whether they served primarily as a mechanism for managing the crowd's emotional experience of the event, channeling potentially volatile collective feeling into a structured ritual that could be controlled and concluded cleanly. The Foucauldian reading, which emphasizes the scaffold as a technology of power, has been enormously influential since the 1970s. The more recent social history approaches, which focus on the crowd as an active participant rather than a passive audience, complicate that reading in ways that are still being worked out in the scholarship. What you know, standing on the platform and looking out at the crowd, is something that neither of these scholarly frameworks quite captures. The specific, physical, immediate knowledge of managing a living situation in real time, of reading hundreds of faces simultaneously, of feeling the mood of the crowd as a palpable presence that shifts and responds to what is happening on the platform with a sensitivity that no single individual's face fully reveals but that the aggregate makes unmistakably legible. You have learned to read crowds the way sailors learn to read weather, not from books, not from formal instruction, but from repeated exposure to the thing itself, from surviving the times when you read it wrong, from the accumulated pattern recognition of a professional who has stood in this spot many times and will stand here many more times before his career is done. After the execution, there is the matter of the body. This is not a small matter. The body of the executed was, in medieval and early modern law, a subject of considerable legal and customary complexity. In many jurisdictions it was your property, or you had specific rights to specific parts of it, and the management of those rights was part of the post-execution process. The crowd begins to disperse. The platform is cleared. The formal witnesses make their formal departure. And you are left, as you are so often left, doing the work that the ceremony requires and that nobody else wants to be involved with. You descend from the platform. The guards have largely gone. The square, so recently full of the city's entire social world, empties with the same speed that it filled, as if the community that assembled itself for the event cannot quite wait to dissemble itself back into the ordinary separateness of individual lives. Someone needs to collect the equipment. Someone needs to manage the remains. Someone needs to do the things that come after the main event, the maintenance and logistics of what has just happened, the unglamorous tail end of the civic spectacle. That someone, as it always is, as it will always be, is you. The body is still warm, and you are already thinking about the rope. Not in any morbid or dramatic sense. You have long since passed the point where the proximity of death requires conscious management, but in the practical, professional sense of a craftsman assessing the condition of his materials after use. The rope has done its job. The question now is what else it can do, because in the medieval and early modern economy of your position, very little that passed through your hands was without secondary value, and the rope that had just been used in a judicial execution was, by the standards of the folk medicine market, approximately as valuable as a moderately good vintage of wine and considerably easier to sell without questions being asked. This is the section where we talk about money. Specifically, about the remarkable variety of ways in which you supplemented your municipal salary, because while that salary was real and reliable and better than what many craftsmen earned, it was not the whole of your income, and the whole of your income was considerably more interesting than the base pay suggests. You were, in the economic language of your time, a man with multiple revenue streams, and several of those streams flowed from sources that would require some explanation to a modern audience and rather less explanation to your medieval neighbors, who understood the logic perfectly well even if they found it, in some cases, slightly uncomfortable. Let us begin with the rope, since we are already holding it. The rope used in a judicial execution was, across much of medieval and early modern Europe, believed to carry significant magical and medicinal properties. Properties derived not from anything inherent in the hemp itself, but from its association with the moment of death, with the power of justice, with the concentrated spiritual energy of the execution ground. A piece of execution rope worn around the wrist was believed in various folk traditions to prevent headaches, cure fever, bring good luck in games of chance, and protect the wearer from a range of misfortunes. Pieces of the rope were sought after by people who would never have admitted this preference in polite company, but who would, in the right circumstances, approach the executioner privately and make their interest known. You sold it. Of course you sold it. The rope was yours by customary right in most jurisdictions. It was part of the executioner's traditional perquisites, the accumulated body of informal entitlements that supplemented the formal salary in ways that were understood by everyone involved and documented by almost nobody, because these were not the kinds of transactions that anyone was eager to commit to writing. A piece of execution rope, cut to a useful length and sold at a price that reflected its scarcity and the social risk involved in acquiring it, represented a meaningful supplement to your income. You did not advertise this service. You did not need to. The information found its way to the people who wanted it through the same informal channels that all socially awkward but widely desired transactions moved through, quietly, deniably, effectively. The mainstream historical fact here is that the trade in execution-related materials was extensive, documented, and entirely integrated into the broader medical and magical marketplace of medieval and early modern Europe. This was not a fringe activity conducted by credulous peasants on the margins of society. The buyers included educated people, wealthy people, people who in their formal public lives would have been horrified to be associated with anything so superstitious, and who in their private lives were perfectly willing to pay handsomely for a piece of rope or a small quantity of execution ground soil if they believed it would help with the specific problem they were trying to solve. The medieval and early modern magical marketplace was not divided along clean lines of class or education. It was, like most markets, divided along lines of need and purchasing power, and both were distributed fairly democratically across the social spectrum. The body itself was the richest source of secondary income, and also the most legally and socially complex, because the rights to the body of the executed were defined differently in different jurisdictions and were occasionally contested in ways that required legal resolution. In many places, you had the right to the condemned's clothing, which sounds modest until you consider that clothing in the medieval period represented significant material value, that a condemned person of means might be wearing garments worth considerably more than your monthly salary, and that the second-hand clothing market was a real and active economic institution. The executioner who stripped the clothing from the executed and resold it in the second-hand market was engaged in a transaction that everyone understood, that no one particularly liked to think about, but that the law in most jurisdictions explicitly permitted. Beyond the clothing, the body itself was believed to possess medicinal properties that the folk medicine tradition had catalogued in considerable detail. Human fat, specifically the fat of the executed, was used as a topical treatment for a range of conditions including joint pain, skin disease, and the various ailments that the period lumped under the general heading of rheumatism. The logic in the magical framework of the time was not entirely without internal consistency. The executed person had died with their vital energy at its peak, interrupted suddenly at the moment of maximum life force, and that energy had been transferred to the body's tissues in a form that could be extracted and applied therapeutically. This was not science, but it was a coherent belief system, and it generated real demand for a material that you were uniquely positioned to supply. The harvesting and sale of human fat from executed criminals was not, it must be said, something that most executioners advertised openly. But it was sufficiently common that it appears in the records, in complaints, in the context of legal disputes about rights to the body, in the occasional ecclesiastical objection, with enough regularity to establish it as a genuine practice rather than an occasional aberration. You were careful about it. You were discreet. The transaction happened in the space between what was formally permitted and what was formally prohibited, a space that your entire professional life had trained you to navigate with considerable expertise. There was also the matter of the Hand of Glory, which is one of the more entertainingly Gothic entries in the catalogue of execution-related magical materials, and which earns its mention here both for its historical reality and for its magnificent absurdity. The severed hand of a hanged man, prepared according to specific folk magical recipes involving smoking, preserving, and the insertion of a candle made from the fat of the same hanged man, was believed to be a powerful magical tool, specifically one that could render the holder invisible or cause the inhabitants of a house to fall into a deep sleep, making it invaluable to burglars and housebreakers with a taste for the theatrical. This was not merely a literary convention. It appears in actual legal records as evidence introduced in actual criminal trials, where defendants were caught in possession of actual prepared hands of glory and offered explanations for their presence that ranged from implausible to spectacular. You did not, presumably, advertise this product. But the raw material, the hand of a hanged man, was yours to dispose of in most jurisdictions, and if someone made you a private offer for a specific item, The transaction was between you and your conscience and whatever amount they were willing to pay. The hand of glory represents, in miniature, the broader market for execution-related materials, a market driven by belief, operating in the informal economy, generating income for the person who was simultaneously the most stigmatized figure in the community and the one with the most unique access to the specific goods this particular market required. The quirky and genuinely wonderful tidbit that belongs here concerns the medicinal use of the blood of the executed, which was believed in several European folk traditions to be particularly efficacious in the treatment of epilepsy. This belief was sufficiently widespread and sufficiently persistent that it generated a documented phenomenon: crowds at public executions that included individuals who had traveled specifically to collect the blood of the executed immediately after the moment of death, believing that consuming it fresh, warm, directly from the execution ground was the most therapeutically potent application. This practice horrified the church, troubled civic authorities, and seems to have generated complex feelings in the executioners who were both the proximate cause of the blood's availability and the figures whom the people seeking it needed to negotiate with for access. Whether you facilitated this or not depended on your specific situation, your relationship with your local ecclesiastical authority, and your assessment of what the crowd's mood would tolerate on a given day. Now, let's talk about your career as an unlicensed medical practitioner, because this is perhaps the most surprising of your secondary income streams and the one that best illustrates the strange logic of your social position. The executioner, across much of Central Europe and in scattered regions elsewhere, had a documented and widely recognized side practice as a healer, specifically as a bone setter, wound treater, and general practitioner of the kind of practical medicine that the formally trained physicians of the period provided to those who could afford them, and that the executioner provided to those who could not, and occasionally to those who could but who needed the executioner's specific expertise rather than the physician's theoretical training. The logic connecting the executioner to healing was not, within its own framework, entirely bizarre. He worked with the human body in ways that gave him an intimate practical knowledge of its structure that most people, including most formally trained physicians of the medieval period, did not possess. He understood how bones broke and how they were positioned relative to one another in ways that came from direct and extensive experience with the breaking and the setting of them. He had, in the context of judicial torture, developed skills in managing the body under extreme physical stress that translated, uncomfortably but genuinely, into a practical knowledge of how bodies responded to injury and what interventions helped them recover. He understood anatomy in the hands-on, empirical way that the university-trained physician of the period, whose training was primarily textual and theoretical, frequently did not. The result was that the executioner in many German cities operated a recognized, semi-formal healing practice that coexisted with his official municipal role in a state of mutual awareness that everyone pretended not to notice. People came to him, privately at the house at the edge of the city, through arrangements that did not involve announcements, with broken bones, dislocated joints, wounds that needed cleaning and binding, ailments that the official medical establishment was either unable or unwilling to treat affordably. He treated them. He charged for it. The income was real, and in some documented cases was substantial enough to represent a significant portion of his total earnings. Historians still argue whether the executioner-healer tradition represents a genuine parallel medical tradition with its own accumulated practical knowledge, or whether it was primarily a function of access, people going to the executioner not because he was better than the physician but because he was cheaper and less socially intimidating and available without the formal gatekeeping of the educated medical establishment. The answer is probably some of both, in proportions that varied by individual and by region, and the distinction matters less than the fact of the practice itself, that the most stigmatized professional in the community was also, for a significant portion of that community, the most accessible healthcare provider. The moonlighting as torturer deserves a note here, though we have touched on it in earlier sections. The judicial torture that you administered as part of your formal role was compensated separately from your base salary in most jurisdictions. A procession fee that acknowledged the specific nature of the service and that was calibrated, in the bureaucratic way of all medieval compensation structures, to the type and duration of the procedure. This was not a windfall. It was a line item, paid through the same municipal accounting systems that handled everything else, documented in the same expense records, and viewed by the city as a necessary operational cost of the judicial system rather than anything particularly remarkable. You billed for it. The city paid. The records survive. There was also the matter of the pillorying, the management of the town stocks and pillory for lesser offenders, who were sentenced to public exposure rather than death or mutilation. You managed these proceedings too, which involved not just securing the condemned in the pillory but managing the crowd's participation. Because pillorying was explicitly participatory in ways that hanging was not, the crowd was expected to throw things, to insult, to contribute physically and vocally to the punishment, and you were there to ensure that this participation stayed within the informal limits of what was acceptable rather than crossing into the category of actual mob violence, which the city neither intended nor wanted. This crowd management skill, which we have seen in the context of executions, was one of your most transferable competencies, and the city paid for it whether the stakes were lethal or merely humiliating. You were, in the economic summary of your position, a municipal specialist in the application of state-sanctioned force, a medical practitioner of the informal economy, a supplier of goods to a market that operated in the space between official tolerance and official prohibition, and a craftsman whose specific knowledge base had been accumulated over years of irreplaceable practical experience. The income from these various streams, taken together, could make you genuinely comfortable, not wealthy in the aristocratic sense, not mobile in the social sense, but comfortable in the material sense that translated into good food, adequate clothing, a house that kept the weather out, and the specific satisfaction of a man who has mastered his trade, even if his trade has mastered him in ways he did not fully anticipate when he first took the appointment. The money was real, the comfort was real, and every morning when you went out to earn it, you did so in the knowledge that the community whose justice you administered, whose criminals you removed, whose sick you quietly healed, whose magical needs you discreetly supplied, would still, without fail, find somewhere else to stand when you walked into the room. You had learned by now to find this funny. On good days, the candle on your workbench burns lower, and you are kneeling. Not in front of an altar exactly, though the distinction between your private devotional space and an altar is one that the church would have opinions about and that you have long since stopped inviting the church to weigh in on. You are kneeling in the private space of the house at the edge of the city, in the hour before the city fully wakes, performing the ritual of morning prayer with the focused sincerity of a man who has very specific things he needs to say to God, and a very limited window in which to say them before the day's demands make interior silence impossible. You pray with the particular intensity of someone whose relationship with the divine is not abstract or theoretical but immediate and professionally urgent, because you are a man who deals in the boundary between life and death on a regular basis, and the theological implications of that boundary are not, for you, a subject of comfortable Sunday afternoon speculation. They are your working conditions. The faith of the medieval executioner is one of the aspects of this life that the historical record preserves most imperfectly, precisely because it lived in the interior, in private prayer, in the quality of attention brought to religious observance, in the specific content of the conversations a man had with his confessor in the privacy of the confessional, rather than in the kind of public, documented behavior that the archives were built to record. What we can reconstruct comes from indirect sources, the religious imagery on executioner swords, the records of ecclesiastical disputes about the executioner's access to sacraments, the occasional memoir or diary entry that gives a glimpse of inner life, and the broader theological culture that shaped how any medieval Christian understood their place in God's economy. That theological culture was genuinely, sincerely present in the executioner's life in ways that modern secular readers sometimes find difficult to fully credit. This was not a man performing religious observance because it was socially expected. The social expectations around his religious observance were, as we have seen, complicated and frequently hostile. He was not going to church because the neighbors would talk if he didn't, because the neighbors were already talking regardless. His faith, when it was present because the alternative, doing this job without a framework that gave it meaning, without a theological structure that located his actions within a larger moral order, was not a sustainable psychological option for most people and for most centuries. You needed a reason. The church, whatever its ambivalence about your immortal soul, provided one. The central theological question of your professional life, the one that your confessor probably found most challenging, and that the ecclesiastical authorities of your region had probably issued some guidance on that you had read and partially found helpful, was whether the killing you performed was sin. The official answer in most periods and most jurisdictions was no. Augustine of Hippo, whose theological legacy shaped medieval Christian thought in ways that cannot be overstated, had argued in the 5th century that the soldier who kills in a just war and the executioner who kills in the service of legitimate authority were not murderers, that the moral weight of the killing rested on the authority that commanded it rather than the hand that performed it. You were an instrument. Instruments are not culpable for what they are used for. The magistrate who signed the warrant bore the moral responsibility. You bore the sword. This was enormously useful theology, and you clung to it with the specific gratitude of a man for whom it was not an abstract philosophical position but a daily working comfort. The killing was not sin. The authority was legitimate. You were serving God's justice through the mechanisms of human law, and God, who had instituted human law for precisely this purpose, understood and accepted your service. You were fine. Probably. The probably was where the confessor earned his fee, because the theology was not, in practice, quite as clean as the Augustinian summary makes it sound. The question of whether the killing was sin was separate from the question of whether the killing left a residue, a spiritual contamination that was not guilt exactly, not sin in the formal theological sense, but something more like the ritual impurity of the Old Testament tradition, carried forward into Christian practice through the folk theology that ran alongside and beneath the official doctrine like an underground river. Blood had power. Death had weight. The person who regularly handled both was not simply clean, regardless of what the formal theological position held. The unofficial theology of the community, the folk belief that the priest could not quite endorse but also could not quite stamp out, said that something clung to you and that something required management. The management took several forms. Ritual purification was one, the careful washing after an execution that had both practical and symbolic dimensions. The specific prayers before and after. The confession that followed execution days with a regularity that your confessor had presumably come to expect, the way a doctor expects appointments after flu season. You did not wait for the scheduled confession. You went when you needed to go, which was after the days that required it most, and you told your confessor what you had done with the focused, specific honesty of a man who was not performing contrition but genuinely seeking it. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this section is one that surprises people. In several documented cases from medieval and early modern Germany, executioners actively petitioned civic and ecclesiastical authorities for formal spiritual rehabilitation, for official recognition that their souls were not compromised by their profession, that they were full members of the Christian community with all the spiritual rights that membership entailed. These petitions were not always granted. They were not always even formally addressed. But their existence tells us something important, that the executioner who worried about his soul was not simply being neurotic, was not suffering from a personal crisis of faith that better theology could have resolved. He was responding to a genuine, institutionally maintained ambiguity about his spiritual status that the Church had created and perpetuated and never quite resolved. The question of last rites for the executioner himself is one of the more poignant corners of this subject. You administered, in a professional capacity, the conditions under which other people received their last rites. You had watched the priest work, had given the process its necessary time and dignity, had understood its importance from the outside in ways that most lay people only understood theoretically. What would happen when it was your turn? Could you receive the full sacramental preparation for death? Would the priest come? Would the community gather, as communities were supposed to gather around their dying members, to provide the collective spiritual support that good Christian dying required? The answers varied. In communities where the executioner had maintained good relationships with his parish priest, and some did, through the consistent sincerity of their observance and the quiet respect with which they managed their ecclesiastical interactions, the answer was probably yes. The priest would come, the rites would be administered, the community would at minimum not actively prevent it. In communities where the relationship was colder, where the ecclesiastical ambivalence about the executioner's status had hardened into something approaching active hostility, the answer was less certain. The historical record contains examples of executioners who died and were buried in unconsecrated ground, not because they had been formally excommunicated, which was rare, but because the informal mechanisms of exclusion that had operated throughout their lives continued to operate at the end of them. Now let's talk about the superstitions, because they were everywhere, and they were yours as much as anyone else's, and the line between official theology and folk belief was one that nobody in the medieval period maintained with any particular consistency. The execution ground itself was understood, in the folk tradition of most of Europe, to be a site of concentrated spiritual power, a thin place in the old Celtic formulation that Christianity had absorbed and domesticated, where the boundary between the living world and whatever came after it was unusually permeable. The bodies buried there, executed criminals who in many jurisdictions could not be buried in consecrated ground, were believed to remain spiritually active in ways that the bodies of those who had died naturally did not. The soil of the execution ground had properties. The air around it had a quality. Animals behaved strangely near it, or so the folk tradition held, and animals, particularly dogs and horses, were understood to have a sensitivity to spiritual presences that humans had mostly lost. You worked in this place regularly. You knew it in all weathers, in all seasons, in the specific quality of light that different times of day cast over its soil. You probably had opinions about it that you did not share with anyone, because some opinions are not for sharing, and the executioner who expressed complex feelings about the spiritual atmosphere of the execution ground was not going to find a sympathetic audience in the tavern he was already not welcome in. The tools carried their own superstitions, layered on top of the practical knowledge we have already discussed. The executioner's sword was believed, in various folk traditions, to retain something of every execution it had performed. Not the souls of the executed, exactly, but something more like the accumulated weight of those moments, a spiritual charge that built up over time and that required management through ritual rather than cleaning. Some executioners had specific practices around their swords that combined practical maintenance with ritual purification, the specific prayers said over the blade, the specific timing of its sharpening, the specific way it was stored between uses, that blended the professional and the spiritual in ways that the official church would have viewed with varying degrees of discomfort. The rope, whose medical and magical properties we have already discussed from the buyer's perspective, had its own superstitious freight from your side of the transaction. A rope that had failed, that had broken during an execution, or had not produced the intended quick death, was considered particularly powerful, carrying the additional charge of a death that had been interrupted or delayed. Whether this made you more likely or less likely to sell such a rope depended on your personal beliefs and your assessment of your customer, because the power attributed to a failed execution rope was not straightforwardly benign. Power in the folk tradition was morally ambiguous in ways that official theology was not, and a piece of rope that had been associated with a botched hanging might be sought after by people whose intentions were not entirely focused on headache prevention. The quirky historical tidbit that belongs in this spiritual section concerns the belief, documented in several German and Swiss sources, that the executioner could cure certain diseases simply by touching the affected area, that the same hands that had administered death had thereby acquired a healing power that ordinary touch did not possess. This belief was the mirror image of the contamination logic we discussed earlier, the same association with death that made the executioner's touch polluting in the social context made it potentially therapeutic in the medical one. People sought out this touch, secretly, furtively, through the same informal channels that moved all transactions involving the executioner, but they sought it, and in some documented cases they paid for it, and the executioner who provided it was navigating the strange intersection of folk medicine and folk magic that characterized the informal healing economy of his world. Historians still argue whether the executioner's association with both death and healing reflects a genuinely ancient tradition, a pre-Christian figure who stood at the boundary between life and death in a shamanic or priestly capacity, or whether it is better understood as a pragmatic folk response to the specific knowledge and access that the executioner's professional role provided, with the magical rationale added after the fact to explain a practice that was primarily economically motivated. The pre-Christian interpretation has a certain romantic appeal, and it has attracted serious scholarly attention. The pragmatic interpretation has the advantage of requiring fewer assumptions about cultural continuity across the Christian conversion. Neither entirely explains why the belief persisted as long and as widely as it did. What you knew, in the practical terms of your daily life, was that your relationship with death was specific and regular and professionally managed in ways that most people's was not, and that this relationship gave you a perspective on mortality that was genuinely different from what your neighbors experienced. You had seen enough deaths to know that they were not all the same, that people died with different qualities of presence, different qualities of readiness, different relationships to what was happening to them, and this knowledge, which you had never asked for and which came with no particular instruction manual, was something you carried in the way that all specialized knowledge is carried, as both a resource and a weight. You had also seen enough deaths to have strong opinions about the theology of what came after. Not the official theology, you knew that perfectly well, had heard it from the priest at every execution, had received it in your own religious formation, but the personal, experiential theology that a man develops when he has been present at the moment of death often enough to have noticed things that the official account does not quite address. Whether those things were comforting or not was a matter that varied by the specific death, by your own state of mind on the day, by the weather and the crowd and the quality of the light on the execution ground. There were days when what you witnessed at the moment of the execution felt, in some way you could not articulate, like the presence of something larger. There were days when it felt like nothing at all. You did not know what to do with either of these observations, so you kept them private, in the same place you kept most of the things that the job had given you that you had not known how to return. The night after an execution, you slept in the way that people sleep when they are very tired, and when the tiredness is not only physical, heavily at first, then lightly, then in the complicated territory between sleep and waking where the day's events process themselves according to whatever internal accounting system your mind had developed for this purpose. What you dreamed, if you dreamed, is not recorded. The archives that preserved your salary and your appointment terms and your expense accounts had no mechanism for recording dreams, and the dreams of the medieval executioner are consequently among the most private things in the historical record, present in their influence on the waking life they shaped, invisible in the documents that life produced. You woke up in the dark in the house at the edge of the city, and the candle had burned down, and the morning was beginning again outside the shuttered window, and God was in his heaven. You believed this sincerely and specifically because the alternative was something that did not bear thinking about in the small hours of the morning. And the city needed you, would always need you, would never quite be able to admit how much. You got up. You tended the candle. You began again. History has a long memory for failure, and the executioner's profession produced failures of such spectacular public visibility that some of them survived the centuries not merely as footnotes but as genuine legends. Stories that circulated in broadsheets and tavern conversations and eventually in the historical record with the tenacity of narratives that had found, in the telling, something that resonated far beyond the specific facts of the botched execution or the disgraced practitioner they concerned. These stories were cautionary tales, entertainment, professional folklore, and civic mythology simultaneously, and they tell us things about the executioner's world that the formal records of salary and appointment and expense accounts cannot. Let's meet some of the people who actually did this job, because they deserve to be more than a generic second-person pronoun, and because the specific individuals who left enough of a mark on the historical record to be recoverable are, without exception, more interesting than any composite portrait could capture. Franz Schmidt is the obvious place to begin, because Franz Schmidt left behind something that no other medieval or early modern executioner left in anything like equivalent form: a diary. Not a literary diary in the reflective, self-examining tradition of later centuries, but a professional record, a meticulous, methodical accounting of his work as executioner of Nuremberg from 1573 to 1617, recording each execution and each lesser punishment with the focused, factual attention of a craftsman who took his documentation as seriously as his craft. The diary survived, was eventually published, and has since become one of the most remarkable primary sources in the history of criminal justice, offering a window into the professional life of an executioner that is unique in its directness and its detail. Schmidt executed 361 people over the course of his career, a number he recorded with the same precise care he brought to every other aspect of his documentation. He noted the names of the condemned, their offenses, their manner at the execution, the method used, and occasionally brief observations about the character or circumstances of the person he had just killed that carry, across 4 centuries, a quality of human attention that his formal social position would have suggested he was not supposed to possess. His entries are not sentimental. They are not callous. They occupy a register that has no precise modern equivalent. the register of a professional who has found a way to be fully present to his work without being destroyed by it, which is perhaps the most difficult thing his job required and the thing he managed most impressively. The mainstream historical fact about Schmidt that reframes how we read his diary is this. Franz Schmidt spent his entire career working toward a specific personal goal, which was the formal rehabilitation of his family's honor. His father had been conscripted into the executioner's role, compelled to take it against his will as a condition of his own pardon for an offense, and Franz grew up carrying the stigma of a profession he had not chosen and that his family had not chosen. His diary was, among other things, a record of service, an argument made in the language of professional excellence for the proposition that a man who had served the city faithfully for decades, who had performed his duties with skill and consistency and without scandal, deserved to have his family's standing restored. He petitioned the Holy Roman Emperor directly for this rehabilitation. He received it in 1617, the year of his retirement. His son became a physician. The hereditary curse, in the Schmidt family's specific case, was broken, not by escape or denial, but by the slow, documented accumulation of irreproachable professional service. This is moving in the specific way that medieval stories of persistence and dignity are moving, and it is also a reminder that the executioner's social position, however fixed it appeared, was not entirely without the possibility of negotiation. Schmidt found the negotiating lever, the formal petition, the documented record of service, the appeal to imperial authority over the heads of the local community that maintained the stigma, and he used it with the same methodical effectiveness he brought to everything else. Most executioners did not have his literacy, his persistence, or his exceptional 44-year run of professional excellence to draw on. But the possibility he demonstrated was real. Now for the disasters, because the disasters are where the human reality of this profession becomes most vivid and most comprehensible to modern readers who might otherwise find the whole subject comfortably distant. The case of Richard Brandon is worth considerable attention, because Brandon was the executioner of London in the mid-17th century and is the man most historians credit, with the caveat that the historical evidence is not entirely conclusive, with having beheaded King Charles I in January of 1649, which is, by any measure, the highest profile execution in English history and the one that generated the most immediate, intense, and sustained public interest in the identity and subsequent fate of the man who had swung the axe. Brandon initially denied being the executioner. Understandably, given that regicide was a concept that had complicated moral and legal status in a country that had just executed its monarch and might, at some future point, decide it had made a mistake about this, but the circumstantial evidence pointing to him was strong enough that his denial was widely disbelieved. The quirky tidbit that attaches to the Brandon case is one of the more entertainingly grim footnotes in the history of the profession. Brandon reportedly charged an additional £30 for the job, a very substantial sum, and received an orange stuck with cloves as a tip from the king's attendants, which was either a touching gesture of last-minute gratitude or a piece of darkly comic symbolism depending on your perspective. He died a few months after the execution in June of 1649, and the circumstances of his death, whether from natural causes, from the psychological weight of what he had done, or from something else entirely, were discussed with the kind of speculative intensity that attaches to figures who become inadvertent historical symbols. The pamphleteers had opinions. The pamphleteers always had opinions. The figure of Jack Ketch deserves its own extended treatment, because Jack Ketch achieved something genuinely unusual in the history of the profession. He became a cultural archetype. Ketch was the public executioner of London in the 1670s and 1680s, and his name, through a combination of his genuine notoriety, the broadsheet culture of Restoration London, and the particular vividness of his professional failures, became a generic term for executioner that persisted in English usage for generations. When Punch and Judy puppet shows needed an executioner character, they named him Jack Ketch. When 18th century writers wanted a shorthand for the hangman, they reached for Ketch. The name outlasted the man by centuries, which is a form of immortality that Ketch himself would probably have found less satisfying than a quiet retirement. What made Ketch notorious was not his competence but its catastrophic absence at the most visible possible moments. His execution of Lord William Russell in 1683 required multiple strokes. The specific number reported varies between 3 and 4 depending on the source, and all of the numbers are terrible, and generated immediate, furious public commentary. Ketch published a pamphlet defending himself, which is itself a remarkable historical artifact, an executioner explaining himself in print to a literate public, in which he attributed the difficulty to Russell's failure to position himself correctly. This defense was received with the skepticism it deserved, and Ketch's professional reputation, already shaky, absorbed a blow from which it did not recover. 2 years later, in 1685, Ketch was called upon to execute the Duke of Monmouth following the failure of the Monmouth Rebellion, and the result was, by contemporary accounts, one of the most catastrophic public executions in English history. The number of strokes required was reported as 5, though some accounts run higher, and the axe eventually had to be set aside in favor of a knife to complete the proceeding, in front of a crowd that had begun the morning with the ordinary mixed emotions of an execution audience and ended it in a state of genuine collective horror. Ketch was reportedly booed off the scaffold and required a guard escort to prevent the crowd from doing to him what he had so inadequately done to Monmouth. Historians still argue whether Ketch's incompetence was genuine, the result of poor training, nerves, a badly maintained axe, or some combination of these, or whether some of the accounts of his failures were exaggerated by the political climate of the period, in which the executions he was performing were charged with the kind of partisan feeling that shaded every contemporary account. The Monmouth execution in particular happened in a context where public sympathy for the condemned was considerable, and a hostile crowd was predisposed to interpret ambiguous events in the worst possible light. But the existence of multiple corroborating accounts, the pamphlet in his own defense, and the subsequent demotion and near execution of Ketch himself. He was temporarily removed from his position and imprisoned, though he was eventually reinstated, the city finding itself in the perennial executioner's dilemma of needing the problematic one it had more than it needed to replace him, suggests that the failures were real and the incompetence genuine. The German tradition produced its own catalogue of professional disasters, recorded in the meticulous city chronicles that German municipal culture maintained with its characteristic thoroughness. The Nuremberg records, which gave us Franz Schmidt, also preserve the records of his less accomplished predecessors and contemporaries, including cases where the sword failed to complete its work cleanly, where the condemned fell in ways that complicated the stroke, where the crowd's reaction to a botched beheading escalated from discomfort to active intervention. The German records also preserve the formal consequences of professional failure in more detail than most other sources: the fines levied, the formal complaints lodged, the investigations conducted, and in some cases the replacement of an executioner whose repeated failures had exhausted the city council's patience. There is a wonderfully specific case from 16th century Germany in which an executioner, having badly botched an execution, was himself threatened with punishment by the crowd that had gathered to watch, a threat that the city's guards had to physically interpose themselves to prevent, creating the extraordinary situation of the civic authorities protecting the city's official executioner from the city's unofficial mob justice. The executioner in question was subsequently investigated by the city council, fined a portion of his salary, and placed on what amounted to a formal performance improvement plan, a medieval document that specified the standards his future work needed to meet and the consequences of further failure. The PIP, it turns out, is older than we thought. The case of Klaus Stürzel, an executioner active in the Swiss Confederation in the 15th century, represents a different category of professional catastrophe, not incompetence but overreach. Stürzel was accused of exceeding the parameters of his authorized role in ways that the records do not detail with complete clarity, but that were serious enough to result in his own arrest and trial. The executioner who became the defendant, who found himself on the other side of the justice system he had spent his career administering, occupied a position of almost unbearable irony, and the community's reaction to this irony was documented in terms that suggest the case generated considerable public interest and debate. What happened to Stürzel subsequently is not entirely clear from the surviving records, which is itself a form of historical verdict, important enough to be noted, not important enough to be followed up. The question of what happened to an executioner who was himself sentenced to death is one that the historical record addresses in scattered but consistent ways. In most jurisdictions, the condemned executioner was executed by another executioner brought in from a neighboring city. because the practical and symbolic problem of an executioner performing an execution on himself was insuperable in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The imported executioner was a practical solution and also, in its way, a professional courtesy. You did not ask a man to do this particular job on a colleague, even a disgraced one. You brought in someone with no personal connection to the situation, paid him his fee, and managed the proceeding with as much dignity as the circumstances permitted, which was sometimes not very much. The records of famous executioner families, the Sansons of France, deserve their own moment here, show how the hereditary system managed both excellence and failure across generations. The Sanson family held the position of executioner in Paris and its surrounding regions from 1688 through 1847, a span of nearly 2 centuries that encompassed the entirety of the French Revolution and the Terror, the introduction of the guillotine, and the gradual transition toward the abolition of public execution. Charles-Henri Sanson, the most famous of the dynasty, served as chief executioner of Paris during the Revolution and administered the guillotine to Louis XVI in January of 1793, completing, in the French tradition, the pattern we saw in England with Brandon and Charles I, in which the most historically significant execution of a monarch fell to the working executioner of the capital. Charles-Henri Sanson was, by all accounts, a man of genuine complexity, reportedly opposed to capital punishment on personal moral grounds, maintaining his role out of professional obligation and family tradition while privately holding views that his job required him not to act on. Whether this personal opposition was genuine or a later biographical embellishment designed to make him more sympathetic is something that historians debate with the same productive inconclusiveness that characterizes most questions about the inner lives of historical figures who left incomplete records. What is certain is that he administered the guillotine to approximately 2,900 people during the Terror, a number that makes Franz Schmidt's 361 seem, if not modest, then at least bounded, and that the psychological weight of this volume of work, whatever his personal views, was something that the family's memoirs, published generations later, addressed with a candor that suggested the weight was real and lasting. The Sanson family's story also illustrates the way that the profession adapted, or failed to adapt, to changing times. The guillotine that made Charles-Henri Sanson's workload during the Terror mechanically possible was initially welcomed by executioners as a genuine professional improvement. A device that removed the most consequential source of professional variability, the human stroke, and replaced it with an engineered consistency that protected both the condemned from botched executions and the executioner from the career-ending disasters that Ketch had demonstrated were always one bad day away. The machine, in this reading, was a mercy to everyone involved, including the man who operated it. But the machine also changed the nature of the job in ways that subtly undermined the executioner's professional identity, because the specific skill that had defined the trade, the technical mastery of the instruments of execution, the knowledge accumulated over generations of professional practice, was partially displaced by an engineered solution that anyone could theoretically operate. The guillotine democratized the act of execution in the same gesture with which it standardized it, and the executioner who had once been the irreplaceable possessor of specific and hard-won expertise found himself instead the operator of a mechanism, a distinction that mattered to professional pride even if it changed nothing about the social dynamics of the role. You are standing at the edge of an era, in this section, looking backward at the long catalog of your predecessors, their triumphs and their disasters, their professional pride and their spectacular public failures, their attempts at dignity in a role that the community they served made dignity difficult to maintain. The Schmidts and the Brantons and the Ketches and the Sansons are your professional ancestors in a lineage that the guild system would never formally recognize, but that was as real, as specific, and as consequential as any guild tradition in medieval and early modern Europe. They learned from each other across generations and across borders. They shared professional knowledge through the networks that the hereditary system created. They built, collectively and without anyone's formal acknowledgement, a body of expertise that the communities they served depended on entirely and appreciated not at all. Their failures were public, permanent, and unforgettable. Their successes were expected, unremarked, and forgotten by the crowd before the square had emptied. This is, perhaps, the most medieval thing about all of them, that the standard of their profession was invisibility when things went right and notoriety when they went wrong, and that they showed up anyway every time in the house at the edge of the city, With the sharp sword and the good rope and the accumulated knowledge of a trade that nobody thanked them for mastering. Nothing lasts forever, and the medieval executioner's world, that strange, stigmatized, professionally complex, spiritually ambiguous world that we have been inhabiting together through these long hours, ended not with a dramatic abolition or a single decisive moment of historical transformation, but with the same gradual, unannounced erosion that most human institutions experience when the ideas that sustain them begin to shift beneath their foundations like soil after a long rain. The scaffold did not fall in a day. The profession did not vanish in a generation. What happened was slower and more complicated and, in its way, more interesting than a clean ending would have been, because the ending of public execution as a social institution tells us things about the society that maintained it for centuries that the beginning and the middle of the story cannot. Let's place you, for this final section, in the later end of your professional timeline, somewhere in the 18th century, in a city that is beginning to have public conversations about things that previous centuries had not considered conversational topics. The Enlightenment is happening around you, which is to say that educated people in coffee houses and in the pages of newly proliferating printed publications are having arguments about reason, about human dignity, about the proper relationship between the state and the individual, about whether the spectacle of public punishment serves the purposes that its proponents claim for it or whether it does something else entirely, something that the growing vocabulary of humanist philosophy is developing increasingly precise language to describe and object to. You are aware of these conversations in the way that a man at the edge of the city is aware of what happens at its center, imperfectly, partially, filtered through the accounts of people who were present at discussions you were not invited to and would not have been welcome at if you had tried. But the conversations are having practical effects that you can observe directly, because the number of capital offenses on the books is beginning, slowly, to contract, and the frequency of executions in your city is declining in ways that are noticeable over the course of a career, even if they are invisible in any single year. The law is changing, slowly, with many reversals and regional variations and the general reluctance of legal institutions to move faster than the political will that animates them, but changing. The mainstream historical fact that anchors this section is the publication, in 1764, of Cesare Beccaria's treatise on crimes and punishments, which is perhaps the single most influential document in the history of criminal justice reform and which made the argument, with a clarity and a rhetorical elegance that its predecessors had not quite managed, that the purpose of punishment was the prevention of future crime rather than the expression of retributive justice, and that public execution, far from achieving this purpose, was more likely to brutalize the watching public than to deter potential criminals. Beccaria's argument was read, discussed, and acted upon by the reforming monarchs of the later 18th century. Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, Joseph II of Austria, with a speed that tells you how ready the political culture was for exactly this argument at exactly this moment. The intellectual scaffolding for abolition had been under construction for decades. Beccaria provided the keystone. What this meant for you, practically, was a gradual thinning of your workload that was not entirely unwelcome on the days when you thought about it honestly, but that carried its own anxieties when you thought about it in economic terms. Your salary was municipal and relatively stable, but the per-execution fees that supplemented it were declining with the declining frequency of executions, and the secondary economy of execution-related materials, the rope, the body parts, the various goods that the folk medicine market had sustained for centuries, was itself under pressure from the same Enlightenment currents that were reforming the legal system. The rational medicine that was slowly displacing folk practice did not have uses for execution rope or human fat. The market was contracting. Your income was contracting with it. The reform of criminal codes across Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries proceeded unevenly, with significant national and regional variation that reflected the different political structures and legal traditions of the various states involved. England maintained a notoriously broad capital code, the Bloody Code as it came to be known, which specified death as the penalty for over 200 offenses at its peak, well into the 19th century, while other European jurisdictions were moving towards significant restriction of capital punishment. The reduction of capital offenses proceeded in England through a long series of piecemeal legislative reforms that began in earnest in the 1820s and continued through mid-century. each reform removing a category of offense from the capital list in ways that cumulatively transformed the scope of the executioner's formal responsibilities. Alongside the reform of the capital code came the reform of the execution itself, the gradual withdrawal of the public dimension that had been, for centuries, the entire social point of the proceeding. This shift is one of the most revealing moments in the history of punishment, because the arguments made for moving executions behind prison walls rather than performing them in the public square cut directly to the heart of what public execution had always been for and what, by the early 19th century, it was increasingly being blamed for. The crowd that gathered for a public execution was no longer being described, by reformers, as a community bearing witness to the legitimate operation of justice. It was being described as a mob, being brutalized by the spectacle it was watching, learning the wrong lessons from the wrong theater, its presence at the execution making the thing worse rather than better. This reframing from legitimate civic witness to dangerous mob was not simply a neutral descriptive shift. It was a political and philosophical argument, advanced by people with specific agendas about what civilization was and what it required, and it was contested by people with equally specific views about the deterrent function of public spectacle and the right of the community to see justice administered in its name. Historians still argue whether the abolition of public execution in the 19th century represented a genuine humanitarian advance in the treatment of condemned persons, or whether it represented the privatization of state violence in ways that removed it from public accountability and made it easier for the state to conduct without the moderating pressure of the crowd's emotional response. Both arguments have serious scholarly defenders, and the tension between them remains genuinely unresolved. What is certain is that the move behind walls changed everything about your job. The crowd that had been, simultaneously, the most stressful and the most meaningful element of your professional existence, the audience whose witness gave the proceeding its social function, whose reaction calibrated your professional success or failure in real time, whose collective presence you had spent a career learning to read and manage, disappeared. In its place was a small group of formally designated witnesses. Officials, journalists in later periods, the occasional observer admitted by official permission, the prison chaplain. The execution became a bureaucratic proceeding rather than a civic spectacle, and in becoming that, it shed much of what had made the executioner's role as complex, as pressured, and as paradoxically significant as it had been. The executioners of the 19th century inherited a profession that was in the process of being hollowed out from both ends simultaneously. From above, the reform of the criminal code was reducing the frequency of their work. From below, the privatization of execution was reducing its social meaning. The result was a figure who retained the stigma of the hereditary role without the peculiar compensations, the public significance, the professional drama, the secondary economy, that had made the stigma, if not bearable, then at least embedded in a context of genuine social function. The quirky historical tidbit that illuminates this twilight period comes from England, where the office of public hangman in the 19th century became, in the most literal sense, a public controversy. The last hangman to operate before executions were moved behind prison walls in 1868 was William Calcraft, who held the position from 1829 to 1874, an extraordinary 45-year tenure that makes even Franz Schmidt's career look brief, and whose methods were criticized with increasing vehemence by reformers, journalists, and eventually the prison authorities themselves. Calcraft used the short drop method, which produced death by strangulation rather than the instantaneous cervical fracture that the longer drop produced, and the prolonged nature of the deaths he administered, sometimes requiring him to pull on the condemned's legs to hasten the end. A practice conducted in public for the first 40 years of his career became a focus of exactly the kind of reform energy that was simultaneously pushing executions behind walls. Calcraft was succeeded by William Marwood, who introduced the long drop calculation that finally resolved, through engineering rather than experience, the problem that had vexed the profession since its earliest days, the calculation of the precise drop required to produce instant death without decapitation, calibrated to the individual weight and physical condition of each condemned person. Marwood's contribution to the profession was genuinely significant, a practical advance that reduced suffering in ways that the humanitarian reform movement could appreciate even as it continued to advocate for abolition entirely. He was also, in the way of all hangmen, deeply ambivalent about the attention his profession brought him. sought it, in some ways, in the manner of a man who has spent a career being invisible and finds a complicated pleasure in being noticed, while simultaneously resenting the terms on which the notoriety arrived. The last public execution in England took place on the 26th of May, 1868, outside Newgate Prison, where Michael Barrett was hanged by Calcraft for his role in the Clerkenwell bombing. The crowd that gathered was large, raucous, and behaved in precisely the ways that reformers had been complaining about for decades. Treating the event as street entertainment, the execution as a set piece in a theatrical outing, the death of a human being as a backdrop to an afternoon socialization. The reformers pointed to this crowd as evidence for everything they had been arguing. Their opponents pointed to the same crowd as evidence that the people wanted public justice, and that removing it from public view was a form of paternalism that respected neither the community's right to witness nor the deterrent function of the visible consequence. And then the execution happened, and the crowd went home, and 3 days later executions moved behind the walls, and the argument continued for generations in the pages of parliamentary debate and academic commentary while the thing itself had already changed. The last practitioners of the trade in the period of its decline were men in an impossible position, inheritors of a professional tradition that the society around them was simultaneously dismantling and sentimentalizing, still carrying the stigma of the hereditary role while performing a job that was becoming less frequent, less visible, and less embedded in the civic life that had given it meaning. The Pierrepoint family in England, 3 generations of hangmen, Henry, Thomas, and Albert, spanned the period from the late 19th century through 1956, when Albert Pierrepoint resigned from the position following a dispute over payment for an execution that was called off at the last minute. Albert Pierrepoint subsequently wrote a memoir, operated a pub, and spent the later part of his life as a man who had opinions about capital punishment that his professional history gave him a unique standing to express. His conclusion, arrived at after a career in which he executed between 400 and 600 people, the records are imprecise, was that capital punishment had never deterred a single crime, a judgment that carried a weight of practical authority that no academic criminologist could quite match. He had been there. He had done the job. He had watched, from the closest possible professional vantage point, the effect of the penalty on everyone involved, the condemned, the witnesses, the prison staff himself, and his assessment was that the deterrent argument was, in the specific technical language of a man who had tested it against reality for decades, wrong. This conclusion from this source was uncomfortable for everyone who had maintained the system he had administered, and it contributed to a cultural conversation that the United Kingdom resolved in 1965 with the abolition of capital punishment for murder. The scaffold came down slowly over a period of centuries, in the way that large and load-bearing social structures always come down. Not all at once, but piece by piece, each piece removed only when the weight it had been carrying could be distributed elsewhere, until eventually what remained was not enough to justify maintaining the structure at all. The executioner went with it into a history that was already, in the final decades of the profession, more interested in him as a symbol than as a person, as a figure that said something about the societies that had created and maintained him, about the relationship between law and violence, about the way communities manage the things they need but cannot bring themselves to acknowledge needing. What the executioner ultimately tells us, across the 8 or 9 centuries of his professional existence in the form we have been examining, is something about the gap between what a society's formal values claim and what its practical arrangements require. The medieval community that despised its executioner while depending on him absolutely, that stigmatized him while paying him a municipal salary, that excluded him from the social life of the community while requiring him to perform the community's most public civic function, was not being hypocritical in any simple or deliberate sense. It was being honest in the way that social arrangements are sometimes more honest than the ideologies that attempt to explain them, about the fact that civilization requires things of itself that civilization's self-image does not comfortably accommodate. The executioner was the place where the community's need for violence, for the specific, authorized, bounded violence of judicial punishment, and its discomfort with that need were given a face, a house, a salary, and a seat in the designated pew. He carried what the community needed to put down somewhere but could not put down on itself. He was the repository of the thing that the law required but the community preferred not to claim ownership of. And in making him carry it, in designating him, stigmatizing him, paying him, excluding him, needing him, The community was doing something that human communities have always done with the necessary and uncomfortable. It was outsourcing the weight of it to a specific person who could be simultaneously acknowledged and ignored, used and kept at a distance, thanked through the mechanism of a salary and never thanked in any other way at all. You have been that person in these 9 sections. You have worn the boots and felt the weight and done the work and gone home to the house at the edge of the city and woken up in the dark and begun again. You know something now that you did not know at the beginning of tonight's journey. Not because the information was hidden, but because information and knowledge are different things, and knowledge requires inhabiting something from the inside rather than examining it from the outside, which is what we have been doing together in the particular intimacy of this long, slow, sleepy evening. And now the lights are very low. The city outside your window, whatever city, whatever century, whatever particular arrangement of stone and timber and human hope and human cruelty surrounds you tonight, is settling into its night sounds. The cart horses are still. The market is long closed. Somewhere far away, a bell is counting an hour that is late enough to be considered, by the honest standards of night, genuinely late. You can set down the boots now. You carried them through something that most people never carry, not because they lack the capacity, but because they never have occasion to look that closely at the machinery of the world they live in, at the people who stand at its edges and keep it running at a cost that the center never fully pays. The medieval executioner was not a monster. He was not a hero. He was a man, and occasionally, in the records that survive, a woman in subsidiary roles, though the central position was almost universally male, doing a job that a society had decided needed doing, in conditions that the same society had decided needed to be unpleasant, carrying a weight that nobody else wanted to carry and that the community addressed by making sure he knew, every day, in 100 small and accumulated ways, that it had not forgotten what he was. He got up anyway. He sharpened the blade. He checked the rope. He walked to the square with whatever steadiness he could manage, and he did the work, and he came home, and the candle burned low and the city slept. Let the city sleep. Let the blade rest in its case, the rope coiled and quiet on its hook, the warrant filed in whatever archive the centuries have or have not preserved it in. Let the house at the edge of the city stand for one more night in the particular silence of a place that has seen everything and is tired, as all old places eventually become tired, and ready for the rest that the morning will briefly interrupt before beginning everything again. You are tired too. The history is done or done enough for tonight. Close your eyes. The scaffold is empty. The square is quiet. The crowd has gone home, every last one of them, back to their warm houses and their designated pews and their separate cups and their small daily lives that required, from a distance, the existence of a person they preferred not to think about. He is not thinking about them either now. He is sleeping, finally, in the house at the edge of the city, where the wall meets the world outside it, where the necessary and the unwelcome have always lived, where the weight of a civilization's ambivalence was carried by one pair of hands at a time, for one generation at a time, in the long and ordinary darkness of the night. Sleep well. You've earned it. Sweet dreams.